Chapter 1237. Jianghu is bustling. Mount Hui suddenly sends out hundreds of invitations to the entire Jianghu world, inviting all the heroes in the world to go to the towering moonless tower on the snowy plateau. Almost no one doubts or sneers at this, because the newly emerged Mount Huizi's fist may not be big, but it is definitely hard enough. Legend has it that she was once the guest of the new King Liang, and then they parted ways. She intercepted Wang Xianji on the Yangtze River, which is an undeniable feat. Her life was hanging by a thread, but it was a blessing in disguise. She is already a real celestial state. God knows if she will become a terrestrial immortal after the closed-door training. There were even busybodies who added fuel to the fire, saying that when Crown Prince Zhao Zhuan was casually touring the south, there was also a secret and wonderful story between him and this purple-robed woman. Mount Hui, which is already full of visitors, is now climbing the mountain. Some experienced Jianghu old foxes start to count which gangs and sects have arrived. For example, the little immortal Wu Shizhen of the Qingyang Palace of Mount Qingcheng is staying at the Mount Hui abode. Also, the master of the Quicksnow Mountain Villa, Weiqi Liangfu, brings his beloved daughter Yuqi Nyochuan, who is entering Jianghu for the first time. The leader of the new Dao Zhuangtai in the northern Liaoxi also swaggers up the mountain. Lin Hongyuan, the young palace master of the southern border Dragon Palace, appears as magnificent as before. There is also the new owner of the Spring Invitation Cottage in Shishu, who is also the winner of the Rouge Beauty Award. Thank you. When she appears, she is regarded as a celestial by countless men. However, when they think of her inextricable relationship with the king of Shu, Chen Jibao, no one dares to make trouble. Mount Longhu has been neighbors with Mount Hui for hundreds of years. The new Taoist master Zhao Ningxian personally comes out of the Taoist master mansion to visit the snowy plateau. Usually, it was as difficult as ascending to the heavens to bump into one of these elusive big shots in Jianghu. Now that they had appeared one after another, it was a feast for the eyes of the onlookers who were not qualified to be honored guests of the moonless brothel. They only felt that the travel expenses they had spent on this trip to Mount Hui were not a problem. In addition to the new top 10 gangs like Mount Longhu, the Spring Invitation Cottage, and the Quicksnow Mountain Villa, there are many old Jianghu sects that can be regarded as leaders in the provinces and counties. There are also the Beggar sect and Chao gang, which are rich but like to pretend to be poor. After receiving the hero's invitation, they also send their most important leaders to Mount Hui. They are either leisurely climbing the mountain to enjoy the scenery or are on the way here. There are also a lot of Jianghu individual immortals, who are all proud of receiving a hero's invitation. For example, Fan Qingsong, who is known as the Central Plain Swordsman in Jianghu, is 90 years old and half of his body is in the ground, but he still has to grit his teeth and risk his life to rush to Mount Hui. As for those who had just entered the Jianghu for a few years but had already made a name for themselves, they were even more ambitious and in high spirits. They wore the best clothes, rode the best horses, and carried the best weapons. Those who were handsome were as elegant as a jade tree in the wind. Those who were born inferior in terms of appearance were at least able to attract attention. Compared to those who had been in the Jianghu for a long time, they knew the principle of relying on clothes when going out to meet outsiders. This made some of the older seniors sigh with emotion. They were indeed worthy of being called the younger generation pushing the older generation forward. Even if the older generation did not die, they would be half dead on the beach. Interestingly, there are very few women who have received the hero's invitation this time. Those who have made a name for themselves in Jianghu can be counted with one's fingers. However, even if Mount Hui does not invite them, it does not mean that they are willing to miss this rare Jianghu event. Those who have strong connections will go hand in hand with the big sections. For the time being, those who have not made a name for themselves in front of the sect leaders and sect leaders will not lose face. In any case, they will shout at some of their admirers who are willing to pay for them. Most of these women are not ordinary, either openly or secretly competing with each other for beauty. Unknowingly, they have added countless topics of conversation in Mount Hui. It is one thing to join in the fun and visit Mount Hui to see the immortals, but finding a place to sleep is a real problem. In the surrounding counties, towns, and villages, as long as there is a place for people to live, it is crowded. Not to mention the inns, even the houses of the inns are opened with money. Nowadays, the neighbors around Mount Hui are busy arguing every day about who has more Jianghu experts. For a time, all kinds of people are mixed in here. It is not that there are no criminals or people who want to fish in troubled waters, but they are all expelled or even killed on the spot by the foreign official of Mount Hui who is in charge of patrolling outside the mountain. During this period, there are a few people who have crossed the river and disregarded the law. In the end, the great foreign official Huang Fangfua personally killed them. After that, from the county magistrate to the prefectural governor, there is no one to collect the corpse. This is the first time that Jianghu has seen the hidden power of Mount Hui. Thousands of people in the martial arts world racked their brains, wanting to reach even higher places in Mount Hui. Even if they were able to show their faces at the sword comprehension stele, it would be a great fortune. Perhaps being in Jianghu was a journey to climb high and look far. Some people stop at the foot of the mountain, some people struggle to reach the waist of the mountain, and then they can only look at the backs of the people. As the lucky people climb higher and higher, there are fewer people at the top. Until they are qualified to be secretly happy, but on the surface they say that it is lonely at the top. Even though there were still 3 days before the start of the martial arts tournament, there were still plenty of tourists. The paths leading up to the mountain were already packed with people. Those who were impatient had already started cursing, and there were also a lot of children crying among them. At the foot of Mount Hui, many tea houses and wine stalls have been temporarily set up for tourists to rest. Not far away is the ferry port, and no less than 100 ships of various sizes go back and forth between Mount Hui and Mount Longhu. Inside the tea houses and wine stalls, there are many people talking loudly. Among them, there is a well-dressed guest who is commenting on the heroes of the world who have passed away with the river. Every time he calls out a name, he will drink a cup of wine. The people named by this person are Wudong's Wang Zhongluo and Hong Shixiang, the sword maniac Wang Xiaoping who will not back down even if he dies, the catman Han Shengxian who is invincible below the land immortal, the dragon tree monk of the 2 Zen temples, the Dongyue sword pool Song Nianqing, the black-clothed sick tiger Yang Taisui, the Shishu blacksmith Jian Jihuang, the spring invitation cottage Xielingzhen, the pair of grandfather and grandson, Shenyuan Dandan and Shenyuan Jingcheng, the pair of Taoist masters from Mount Longhu, of course the old god of sword Li Chungang, and the most important Wang Xianji. In the end, Lu Baijie also has a lot of regrets. Sword fairy Tang Shi, who is expected to become the land immortal of sword, had to give away her sword after becoming the Minister of War. At the next table, a young child with delicate features is snuggling in the warm embrace of his graceful mother. His father is full of smiles, drinking slowly. There is an ancient long sword overflowing with sword qi on the table. Judging from his demeanor, he is definitely not a common person of the Jianghu. The child's voice is clear and sweet. He looks at the man who is full of the smell of alcohol and talks about heroes and asked curiously, "May I ask, uncle, after the death of Wang Xianji in Martial Emperor City, is that king of Beiliang really the most powerful person in the world? My elders said that after he fought with Wang Xianji, his realm is destined to drop greatly. Now, can he still defeat the Beimang military god Tuoba?" The child's words carry no harm and are not annoying. Chapter 12:38. The man who had just finished a cup of wine wiped his mouth and laughed. Just as he was about to pour more wine to drink, he lifted the jug and found that there was not a single drop left. Just as the man was about to ask the shopkeeper for new wine, the child's father stretched out a finger and gently patted the neck of the unopened wine jug on his table. The wine jug leisurely spun around and landed right in front of the man. This method of delivering wine was not mysterious, but this unknown swordsman's ingenuity lay in his control of strength. After the wine jug touched the table, it was as if it had taken root and did not move at all. This level of proficiency was definitely at the second level of the master realm. The man did not hold back. After nodding his head, he poured himself a bowl of wine and drank it all. He said, "Young hero, I, Wang Bopo, am not someone who speaks without thinking. I will only say what I know. Let's not talk about whether the king of Beiliang's realm fell or rose. I only know that after the battle between him and Wang Xianji, the current head of the Wu family's sword tomb came out of the mountain and went to the border of Yuzhou with his sword. He used his 14th sword, but he still could not stop the young king of Beiliang. Now, another senior swordsman who has never appeared in Jianghu has gone to Liangzhou. I guess there will be another great battle. The child waved his hand. I am not a young hero, at least not now. My father said that I must wait until I am 20 years old before I can roam Jianghu alone. My mother has given me more than 10 famous nicknames. Unfortunately, they are like the money I get every year. I can only save them. Sigh, why is it so hard to grow up? All the men and women in the tavern burst into laughter. They were amused by the child's naivety. The woman knocked on her son's head. The swordsman's eyes were gentle and filled with love and pride. This was the feeling that every father would have when looking at their child. The child continued, I really admire the king of Bailiang. One day, I will become his disciple and learn from him. The man couldn't help but tease. Then you'll have to see if that old man will accept you as his disciple. The child was stunned for a moment. He patted his chest and said, Dad said that I have extraordinary talent. I'm a martial arts prodigy that's hard to come by in 100 years. Even if I was born 60 years earlier, I could still spar with Taoist Master Qi of Mount Longhu next door. If the king of Bailiang doesn't accept me as his disciple, then it's really, Mother, what's that phrase again? The woman said softly, casting pearls before swine. The hall was filled with laughter again. The child's father had a helpless look on his face. Inside the tavern, the man and the child were fighting and fooling around. It was a happy and harmonious atmosphere. Suddenly, there was a commotion outside the tavern. Soon, someone ran in and shouted, Little ancestor Qi Xianxia, who left the Taoist master's residence to travel Jianghu for many years, also got off the ferry and climbed up the mountain. Not only this tavern, but most of the people from the nearby tea stalls also ran out. When the child heard the name Qi Xianxia, he just curled his lips. He probably didn't want to move because he didn't think highly of him. He lay on the table and watched his father drink. When there was no one else in the tavern, he whispered in a tone that people from the Central Plains couldn't understand, Dad, does the king of Bailiang disdain to participate in this kind of martial arts competition? If Su Fengyan, who had gone through Beimang, was here, he would definitely be able to tell that this was an authentic Norland dialect. The middle-aged swordsman smiled and said, He's busy dealing with our million-strong army and has no time to pay attention to this. Otherwise, I think he would come. That person, I think he's looking forward to Jianghu. The child stretched out a hand and sighed. So many top masters have left Liang, but we're much luckier. Among the 5 major sects, only the 5th raccoon of Bubang Mountain died. The big and small thoughts of Princess Tomb are still there. The chess and sword music school, Hong Jingyan Sword Qijin, and the bronze men are all still there. None of them died. Speaking of this, the child smiled and said, Dad, you're different from them. You're a sect all by yourself and you're ranked higher than the chess and sword music school. If Mom wasn't from Liang, you could challenge the king of Bailiang and lose to him. As for me, I can take this opportunity to get to know him. The man looked at his wife and said in a pure Liaodong dialect, My dear wife, look at this. Our daughter hasn't grown up yet, but she's already helping an outsider. What will happen in the future? The man's originally warm smile suddenly bloomed with a monstrous aura. The ancient sword that was originally full of sword chi suddenly restrained its sharpness. The woman laughed softly and asked, Who's here? Who's worthy of your treatment? It can't be your archenemy Tuoba or that new white-clothed devil, right? The man looked at her and his majestic aura slowly relaxed. He said with a bit of bitterness, Unfortunately, they're all here. The woman said lightly, You've said long ago that you're leaving Beimang. We can't just tie you up and bring you back, can we? The man with an inconspicuous appearance pinched his chin and said, Back then Her Majesty was... The woman glared and pinched him. What do you mean back then? Didn't she just want to acknowledge you as her son-in-law? What? Are you regretting marrying an old hag like me who'll drag you down? Then you should go back. The man smiled but didn't say anything. At this time, anything he said would be wrong. The more he said, the more mistakes he would make. It was better to keep silent and meditate. The infatuated men in the world, regardless of their status, mostly believed that liking a woman was wrong and hoped that they would never change their mistakes. The child asked, "Dad, you're not a swordsman. Why do you always like to carry a sword? You always didn't tell me the reason before. Can you tell me? If Mom blames you, I'll teach her a lesson for you. In any case, you're the third son and I'm the eldest. There's always something to subdue someone else." The man carefully glanced at his wife. Seeing that she didn't move, he laughed softly and said, "Your mother, when she was young, she only admired that green-clothed, sword-wielding knight-errant. Dad has a lot of skills, but your mother doesn't like them. Later, I can only carry a sword to pretend. Wife, how many years have I carried a sword?" The woman reached out and held her husband's big hand. She said gently, "How many years have you carried a sword depends on how old the child is." The man couldn't help but sigh. That's right. Outside the wine shop, a short, middle-aged man with long arms like an ape glanced at the wine shop. He hesitated for a moment and continued to climb the mountain. He was inconspicuous in the crowd. He, whose surname was Tuoba, chose Mount Hui for the first time in his life to enter the Liang dynasty because Wang Xianji didn't wait for him and Su Fanyan was already waiting for him at the border of Liangmang. Then, the snow plateau where heroes gathered became his first choice. After this person climbed the mountain, 3 new guests came to the wine shop. One was in white, one was in red, and there was a burly man with a bag on his back. They sat across the table from the family of 3. The man who didn't practice the sword but carried a sword with an even more shocking sword aura smiled. He didn't look at the handsome man in white. Instead, he looked at the man with the bag on his back and asked, "Deng Mao, the loser of the loser. Why? Do you want to bully me because you have helpers?" Deng Mao said with a cold face, "Don't you also have 3 people?" The man was stunned by this very cold joke. "You're as shameless as you used to be." Then he ignored Deng Mao, who had a broken spear in his bag, and turned to look at the woman in white and the woman in red. "Luo Yang, you destroyed that divine weapon in the icy plains of the extreme north and ruined the battle between Tuoba and Wang Xianji. Why didn't he cause you any trouble when he brushed past you?" The master of Zhulu Mountain in white looked indifferent. She poured herself a cup of wine and didn't say anything. The child suddenly broke the silence and said with a smile, "You're Luo Yang, right? Among the men in the world, I only admire the king of Bailiang, my future master. Among the women, I only admire you. Why aren't you 2 together? I can call you master and mistress together in the future." Luo Yang laughed and raised her head to drink the wine in the cup. Chapter 1239. Like a bolt of purple lightning, a streak of purple suddenly fell from the top of the plateau onto the ferry. Countless mountaineers were shocked. Shenyuan Qingfeng, who had come out of seclusion, stood on the ferry and looked at a yellow dragon warship under the command of the Qingzhou Navy. An armored officer stood at the bow of the towering ship. Swords and halberds were everywhere on the ship, giving off a different aura than the local Qingzhou soldiers. As the ship approached, the people of Jianghu who had better eyesight all saw a flag with an unexpected word written on it. Su. After recognizing the flag that was fluttering in the northwest of the dynasty, the relatively unfamiliar sabers on the waists of the armored soldiers were on the verge of being called Cold Saber. Shenyuan Qingfeng narrowed her long and narrow eyes. Her mood was far more complicated than her tranquil expression. She didn't care at all about the Bailiang officer standing at the bow of the ship, Hong Yu, who had once been the second guest of Mount Hui after Huang Fangfua. Although he was a martial artist of Jianghu, he was proficient in the art of war, especially cavalry warfare. Later on, he followed that person to Bailiang and didn't hesitate to bear the infamy of being a slave of 2 surnames, hoping to make a name for himself on the battlefield. However, after joining the Bailiang army, he never made a name for himself. Shenyuan Qingfeng originally thought that Hong Yu would be depressed, but unexpectedly, a secret letter arrived on the plateau. The letter said that before the martial arts convention began, Yozhou's new valiant cavalry commandant Hong Yu would lead 100 elites to escort over 90 large chests as a gift to Moonless Pavilion to congratulate Shenyuan Qingfeng on her glorious ascension to the position of martial arts alliance chief. The letter even used the teasing words, unifying Jianghu. Shenyuan Qingfeng sneered and muttered to herself, "You're clearly about to die, but I don't see you speaking so nicely." Inside the large chests on the ship were the treasured secret manuals of Mount Qingliang's tide-listening pavilion's armory. Moreover, they were all first-rate rare books. Xianyuan Qingfeng looked at the rolling river before her. The great river flows east and never returns. Do you want to scatter your wealth and never return? Back then, when I was facing a great calamity, I had to leave you for the sake of Mount Hui's business and my father's dying wish. At that time, you were just an ant in the eyes of the top 10 on the martial arts ranking, but you still didn't hide or retreat. Now that you've become the world's #1 and have 300,000 cavalrymen under Beiliang, you're just facing a Beimang, and you're starting to make arrangements for your death? Xianyuan Qingfeng, who was in seclusion cultivating the heavenly Tao, suddenly felt a wave of anger. Deep down, she had actually always regarded him as her goal. The two of them were different from almost all the other martial arts experts in Mount Liang and Beimang. They hadn't been practicing martial arts for long, and their talents couldn't be said to be rare. They had only managed to reach the peak of Jianghu step by relying on opportunities earned by risking their lives over and over again. Xianyuan Qingfeng, after almost all the experts on the snow plateau died, in order to turn the tide, she abandoned herself and fell into the demonic path, almost destroying her own life. Then, she made a deal with him in Beiliang and absorbed the fate of the Imperial Jade Seal to stabilize her realm. After the battle with Wang Xianji, she used Wang Xianji's God-connecting power to sever her emotions and all the karma of the mortal world. She narrowly passed the personal barrier and returned to her original state, a level higher than that of the Taoist embryo and sword embryo of the Buddha. In the end, because of her out-of-body state, Zhao Huangchao, who had a great connection with the Zhao clan of Liang, escaped from an incomplete black rainbow and fled to the snow plateau before his death. He instilled all the knowledge he had learned in his life into her, allowing her to reach a higher level. She was confident that she could fight Tuoba and Dong Tai with all her strength, although her odds of winning were slightly lower. However, she wasn't even 30 years old yet, and her realm was advancing at a tremendous pace. What martial god of Beimang? What peach blossom sword god? Sooner or later, she would trample them under her feet and turn them into stepping stones for the terrestrial deva, Xianyuan Qingfeng. She firmly believed that the new century of Jianghu was nothing more than a matter between her and him. In the end, he emptied his arsenal in one fell swoop and left her with only his back facing the north. I blocked the river because I wanted to be even with you. You gave me the book because you wanted to be even with me? For some reason, only on this side of Mount Hui, the heavy rain suddenly fell and the mountain was covered in mud. For some reason, Xianyuan Qingfeng didn't reveal any of her qi to resist the sudden rainstorm. However, the moment the raindrops touched her body, her figure flashed and disappeared. In the next moment, she was already walking on a mountain path, allowing the rain to splash on her body. Her purple robe was soaked and wet. The yellow dragon ship was about to dock. Hong Yu raised his head and looked at the huge rock on Bull Hill. The corners of his mouth curled up. Did this count as him returning home in glory? In the Liang dynasty, there were many surplus generals and commandants, not to mention military commandants. However, who would dare to look down on a military commandant of Beiliang, one of the 16 veteran commandants, the valiant cavalry commandant? This title had been held by the senior cavalry general Su Pu, the current cavalry commander Yuan Zuozong, and even the king of Shu, Chun Jibao, for a period of time. Hong Yu was an honest and strong man. Just by looking at his appearance, he looked like a middle-aged villager who spent most of his time in the yellow earth and back facing the sky. In Mount Huishan, it was as if he had always been a head above Hong Yu. Moreover, he himself had never treated the Great Snow Plateau as a place to retire. Hong Yu had his eyes on one person in northern Liang, the Yuzhou general Huang Fucheng. This person came from Jianghu and relied on selling to gain his position as a border official. He had practically paved a broad path for Hong Yu to follow. In Mount Hui, other than Xianyuan Qingfeng, he did not dare to look down on Mount Hui. Huang Fangfua, a guard dog, was no longer in his eyes. It was hard for Hong Yu not to feel happy. However, even so, Hong Yu still had to carefully observe the expression of a young woman beside him. The leader of the Fish Dragon gang, Lu Nerong, was not worth mentioning in terms of martial arts or family background. However, Hong Yu had heard that she was inextricably linked to the king of Baliang. To be honest, along the way, Hong Yu could not understand why the picky Su Fengnian would choose such an ordinary-looking Jianghu woman. After Chun Jibao entered Shu, he had at least supported a beauty named Xie. If he placed such a pretty girl beside him, she would at least be pleasing to the eye. Then what was the king of Baliang after? Hong Yu was puzzled. Could it be that the Jianghu people in Baliang were just teasing Jianghu people? As a bystander, Hong Yu did not understand. As a participant, Lu Narong did not understand either. The status that she and the Fish Dragon gang had today was like an autumn dream, untimely and untimely. Lu Narong raised her head and looked at Mount Hui. On the mountain peak, she could only see the eaves of the tall buildings on the mountain. The woman in purple from before was like a bolt of purple lightning descending to the world. What a grand style! Lu Narong admired such a woman from the bottom of her heart. She felt that if Shenyuan Qingfeng, who had relied on himself to ascend the throne of the Wulin Alliance, could travel Jianghu with that person, it would be a good match. For no reason, Lu Narong thought of the trip out of the fortress. She did not know why, but she had forgotten the ups and downs of the battles all these years. However, she clearly remembered the well water in the small fortress and the comical scene of that person squatting at the mouth of the well and haggling with the water peddler. Lu Narong withdrew her gaze and looked at the turbid river flowing east. Occasionally, a few fish would jump out of the river and fall back into the river. She did not know whether they were returning home or leaving. When the junk ship reached the shore, the ship slowly bumped into the dock. Lu Narong, who was slightly swaying, muttered to herself, "If you left the court and did not become the king of Baliang, how comfortable would it be to be just a Jianghu person?" Chapter 1240. That year, the smoke of war was everywhere, but it did not burn such an inconspicuous town. It was not a place that the military would fight for. Although it was Jiangnan, there was not much fertile land. According to a few businessmen who had traveled extensively, there was a disaster north of the Guangling River. But to the people of the small town who lived in a corner, it was good to be a frog at the bottom of the well. The sky was always only as big as the mouth of the well. Peace was a blessing, and contentment was happiness. Today, the small town was in a continuous autumn rain. Looking from the entrance of a restaurant, there were pedestrians with hurried footsteps holding umbrellas as they walked across the bluestone bridge. Business was slow, and there was no need to serve customers. The waiter of the restaurant sat idly at the entrance, waiting for the woman he admired to come closer. She said that she would follow her friend to the rouge shop next to the restaurant to choose because her friend was about to get married. She was going to marry into a good family and was a scholar with scholarly honors. The waiter sighed, feeling a little bitter in his heart. The speaker did not mean it, but the listener meant it. She did not care about glory and wealth, or else she would not have taken a fancy to a cripple like him. But for better or for worse, he was a man who still had some sense of responsibility. He always wanted to let the woman he liked live a good life. Although she was not from a noble family in town, she was a well-known good person. Her family was well off, and she did not have to worry about food and clothing. She had a good temperament, and her needlework was 1 in 100. Everyone said that whoever married her was a blessing accumulated from several lifetimes, but she had taken a fancy to him. Because of this, her playmates who grew up with her were so angry that they almost broke off their friendship with her. While they fought for justice for her, they could not do without some strange words. For example, she had met a bad man and was blinded by lard. These were all said directly in front of him and her. At that time, she looked at him, her slender little hands shyly twisting the corner of her clothes, her eyes full of apology. Fortunately, he was thick-skinned and could still hold back his laughter. But how could his heart not be filled with guilt? Someone patted him on the shoulder, and he turned his head to look. The guy who could be considered familiar with him sat down beside him and asked with a silly smile, "Brother one, what are you thinking about?" He could be considered to be in the same boat as this kid. But this kid's situation was even worse. He had just moved to the town with his mother last year, and he couldn't even read 10 words from a book when it was spread open. Even if he fought, he wouldn't be of much use. Every day, he would be toyed with by those street ruffians who bullied strangers. It was so miserable that even after buying a new pair of boots with great difficulty, they would be stepped on until they became tattered. He couldn't be a scholar or a fighter. Fortunately, his mother still had some savings and had bought a cloth shop. His days were still bearable, and as long as he endured, he could still survive. He lived close to this guy and was probably the only local who did not add fuel to the fire. Over time, the two of them became so-called friends. He only knew that this kid's surname was Wang and that his father had yet to return from a long trip. He smiled and looked at the raindrops strung together along the eaves. He asked, "Bamboo, have you heard of a saying? Although the rain is wide, it does not moisten the rootless grass." That person was stunned, shook his head and laughed. "Brother one, I didn't know that you were a scholar. What do you mean, is there a story?" The shop assistant surnamed one laughed and said, "I heard it from someone else, so I didn't understand. At that time, I was too embarrassed to ask him, so I pretended that I understood. If I knew, I would have asked him." The young man nicknamed Bamboo was puzzled. "Brother one, you have a scholar buddy?" The shop assistant rubbed his chin and said with a smile, "He's not some bullshit scholar. He just can't beat me." So he blindly showed off these things. The young man was happy. Then this person is really not good. He can't even beat brother one, and he's not a scholar. Isn't he the same as me? The shop assistant rolled his eyes at him, but did not say anything. Bamboo was a young man who could not control his mouth. He was afraid of the people of Jianghu, afraid of the banditry and Jianghu aura of those people, but he also looked forward to Jianghu. He liked to hang out in taverns and tea houses all day long, listening to those who called themselves Jianghu people brag. Now, he was talking to the shop assistant surnamed one about the grand martial arts event that happened once in 100 years. He said that he just found out that there was a woman in Mount Hui who liked to wear purple clothes. Not only was she as beautiful as a fairy, but also had superb martial arts skills. Bamboo was spitting saliva everywhere. He did not notice that brother one beside him was either rolling his eyes or smiling absent-mindedly. Bamboo's mouth was dry. He was not a particular person. He bent down and reached out to cup a handful of rainwater, drank a mouthful, and pretended to be heroic. "Good wine!" The shop assistant smiled and joked. "You even drank the taste of Jianghu?" Bamboo turned his head and stared at the man. He asked seriously, "Brother one, how did you kidnap Miss Lu? Why don't you teach me so that I can find a wife later?" The shop assistant looked profound. He said, "Relying on appearance." Bamboo spat. Seeing that Bamboo didn't believe him, he laughed and said, "You really don't believe me? Back then, when I was wandering around with that brother of mine, we were so poor, and he relied on his face to make a living. I am better than him in everything, but this face I lost to him. Back then, we competed for who was the big brother and who was the little brother from age to skill. If it weren't for the fact that I lost in terms of looks, I would have been able to become the big brother." Bamboo's mouth twitched. In the end, he was kind and did not dig at brother one and his brother. Then, the two of them were silent for a while. They just listened to the rainwater dripping on the stone pavement. Bamboo suddenly whispered, "Brother one, I want to tell you something. You can't tell anyone." The shop assistant said, "It's up to you to say it or not." Bamboo hesitated. "When I moved to town at the beginning of the year, I heard from a Jianghu master that among the masters in the world, one of them has the same name as my father." The shop assistant was amused. "Bamboo, you're good. Your father is the old monster Wang Xianji of Martial Emperor City?" Bamboo was angry. He shouted, "Nonsense! It's the 11th in the world." The shop assistant suddenly fell silent. After a long time, he said softly, "So it's Wang Mingyin." Zhuzi's expression was gloomy as she muttered to herself, "But I know that my father is actually a farmer with only a few kilograms of strength. It's not a big deal. It's even better if he's not the 11th in the world who died outside Xiangfan City. Mother and I can wait for him to come home one day." The shop assistant sighed. He did not know how to comfort him. He just patted his shoulder. Bamboo suddenly stood up, pointed at the small bridge, and laughed. "Brother one, I won't delay you. I'll go first." The shop assistant surnamed one followed Bamboo's finger and saw a woman holding an umbrella across the bridge, slowly walking over. He stood up with a bright smile. The first time he saw her was when they met by chance at the town's market when he returned home. At that time, her friends laughed at him for being a cripple. They did not speak well and treated him as a lecher. She was the only one who was different. In the past, Xiaoyan said that he fell in love with every woman he saw and fell in love with anyone at first sight. He originally thought that when he met the woman before she returned home, she would be the last woman he fell in love with at first sight, and in fact it was indeed so. After that, he no longer fell in love with anyone at first sight, but after meeting her in the small town, he felt that if he could spend the rest of his life with her, it would be better than anything else. He jogged out. She had just walked off the bridge. There were advantages of being small in the small town. There was no rigid etiquette of men and women touching each other, and she was not afraid of this. She tilted the oil paper umbrella, her face was slightly red, and shielded him from the rain. He was never glib-tongued when he was with her, and in fact, after returning home, he was no longer as outspoken as before. He was honest and ordinary, and this was probably what she liked about him. In the past, as soon as he saw a woman, he would dare to flirt with her and say, "Miss, this big brother will help you cook the rice." If the woman ignored him, he would say, "Miss, you must have cultivated 3 lifetimes of fortune to be able to meet me. If you don't marry me, you must have suffered 8 lifetimes of bad luck." If the woman flew into a rage out of humiliation, he still had countless backup plans. But he was different now. At that time, when he saw a beautiful woman, his mind was filled with thoughts of getting out of bed. Now, standing beside her, he did not even have the courage to hold her hand. In the pugilistic world, there was him. Outside the pugilistic world, there was her. God did not owe him Wenhua anything. She lowered her head and mustered up her courage to say, "My father helped me arrange a marriage, but I didn't agree." He scratched his head and did not say anything. She pursed her lips. He suddenly smiled and said, "Why don't we have a son in the future?" She opened her mouth slightly, her face full of astonishment. He let out a long breath. It did not seem like he was joking, and said, "Back then, I was engaged to a child. Whoever had a daughter would be at a disadvantage. Of course, if we had a daughter, that would also be very good." She turned her head, her face red, but seemed to nod. He inadvertently lowered his head and saw that her hand that was not holding the umbrella was twisting the corner of her clothes out of habit. He gritted his teeth and finally mustered up the courage to hold her hand again. She gently pulled her hand away and then let him hold it. When Hua grinned, he did not hold the sword. Holding her hand, this kind of pugilistic world was better than anything. Chapter 1241. Outside the elixir garden, a carriage arrived late and slowly parted the crowd. Then the audience saw a slender figure lift the curtain and get off the carriage. He walked up the steps and onto the elixir garden. In his hand was an ancient sword with a simple scabbard. In the past 100 years, the way of the sword had never been popular. There had never been a young swordsman who could learn invincible swordsmanship just by finding a secret manual. This was all thanks to Li Chuangong's sword style. Dong Tai's swordsmanship was beyond that of the ancients. Of course, there was also the Dongyue sword pool's swordsmanship. Every new sword produced by the sword pool was a treasure that all Jianghu swordsmen dreamed of. However, in the field of swordsmanship, Western Shu had always been an anomaly. There was a saying that, the older the sword, the more precious it is. Among the top 3 swords of Shu, except for the Earth-Skin Z, that had accompanied the Sword Emperor of Western Shu out of Jianghu, the Way of Shu and the Thunderbox had never fallen out of the top 10 swords in the world. No one knew who was the first to recognize the name of the ancient sword. For a while, everyone was talking about the Way of Shu. Everyone knew that after the fall of Western Shu, the sword had been sealed in the tide-listening pavilion for many years. Finally, it had seen the light of day again. There were also some tactful spectators who were about to kneel down and kowtow to the young man when they saw him. However, when they were halfway through their words, they realized that everyone around them was rolling their eyes at them. They could only give up and swallow their flattery. Northern Liang had the blood of martial arts flowing in their veins. In the eyes of most of the common people and Jianghu people, since this new Prince Liang had come with a light carriage, He didn't want to put on airs of killing the eldest son. Instead, he wanted to have a fair competition of martial arts. This was not the Central Plains, where the fist was the only thing that mattered here. Otherwise, why would it be said that the civil officials of Beiliang could defeat the generals of Liang imperial court with one hand? The reason why the Beiliang people were able to tolerate the numerous general-class families and the 20 years of oppression was also because of their natural disposition. It was true that those general-class children had committed crimes, but who asked their fathers to be generals who had rolled out from a pile of corpses? It was also a skill for others to be reincarnated into a good family. If they were not reincarnated into a good family, there was nothing to complain about. The most important thing was to let their children be reincarnated into a good family in the future. Probably because he had waited for too long, Sui Xiegu yawned and his snow-white eyebrows fluttered in the wind. Apparently, Su Fengyan wanted the Ancestor Eater sword to wait a little longer. After entering the pill seed field, he didn't show any signs of fighting immediately. Instead, he leaned his sword on the ground and placed his palm on the hilt. This kind of appearance, in the eyes of the spectators outside the field, could really be counted as the so-called Yuji Yuanqi expert's demeanor. The Beiliang people's internal strife was fierce, but their degree of xenophobia was no less inferior. Compared to the unfamiliar old man who didn't carry any weapons, they naturally felt closer to this prodigal who had turned over a new leaf and was once known as His Royal Highness. Therefore, when Su Fengyan appeared on the stage, there was a burst of cheers and applause. Sui Xiegu, whose qi flowed like a magnificent waterfall, looked around and finally stared at Su Fengyan. A battle between experts was a battle of strength, battle of qi, battle of wits and battle of courage. Ultimately, it was still a battle of the heart. Sui Xiegu wanted to ask this young number one person in the world who was the strongest. Naturally, he wanted to fight to his heart's content. This was also what the old man was puzzled about. If the tide listening pavilion restricted the movements of both parties, wouldn't the pill seed field be even more restricted? However, since the kid had called for a battle here, Sui Xiegu couldn't be bothered to reject. After all, if the innocent were to be implicated, it would be the people under this guy's rule. Sui Xiegu had been in the Jianghu for almost 100 years and had always been alone. There was nothing to be concerned about. Sui Xiegu was not a magnanimous person. If he made it clear that Su Fengyan didn't know the severity of the situation and insisted on putting on a show, Sui Xiegu would definitely kill him. As for whether the enigmatic Su Yanbing would chase after him for thousands of miles, or whether the Beiliang's 300,000-strong cavalry would chase after him, why would Sui Xiegu care? If he really wanted to argue, the sword-eating elder was more worried that the old lady from the Guanyin sect would hold a grudge against him. However, that was all. Su Fengyan looked at Sui Xiegu in a daze. Thinking back to the time when he was following the old man in the sheepskin fur coat, when he first heard that an expert could travel hundreds of miles in an instant, it was like hearing a heavenly book. When he reached the top step by step, especially when he was a celestial being, he was able to look down on the mysterious celestial phenomenon of the first grade level 4. He also had a unique understanding of the mysteries of martial arts. The sword-eating elder in front of him was not the same as the average martial artist. He was a little similar to the young martial granduncle who rode the bull. He walked the path of the heavenly way and his route was the creation of all living things. Although the path was the same, there was a difference in the width of the path. Hong Shixiang's path was obviously wider. However, Sui Xiegu used the sword to seek the Tao. Ever since Sui Xiegu picked up the sword, he had spent a total of 80 years cultivating it meticulously. Whether it was the flow of blood and qi, the circulation of qi in the organs and lungs, or the opening and closing of the cardinal acupuncture points, all of them were at the peak of perfection. Rather than saying that the old man used the sword to seek the Tao, it was more accurate to say that Sui Xiegu had already used the Tao to develop the sword. This was probably the reason why Sui Xiegu dared to challenge Wang Xianji. The old man's physique and martial arts were not as high as Wang Xianji's. However, as long as Wang Xianji did not dare to claim that he was superior to the heavenly way, then both of them would have a chance. At this moment, there was a white rainbow that came from tens of thousands of miles away and crashed into the pill garden. Everyone subconsciously closed their eyes to avoid the dazzling light. When they slowly opened their eyes, they did not know why there was still nothing strange in the pill garden. The old man with snow-white eyebrows was still there, and the new Prince Liang, Su Fengyan, was also calm. Other than that, there was nothing else on the pill garden. However, Sui Xiegu seemed to be angry and grunted. Su Fengyan, whose palm was placed horizontally on the sword hilt, suddenly smiled, as if a knot in his heart had been untied. Chapter 1242. Back then, he had once met the Grand Tutor of Beimang, Li Qingshan, for the second time on the muddy road. He did not know whether it was before or after, but it was also good karma. The Qilin Taoist had said he was about to ascend, and he had indeed ascended. However, before Li Qingshan ascended, he had visited Beiliang as a streak of light and personally brought a message to Su Fengyan. It was a pity that apart from Sui Xiegu, who possessed a profound cultivation, no one else could appreciate such a shocking scene. The several thousand people outside the pill garden fields only took a blink of an eye, but to Su Fengyan and Li Qingshan, it felt like the time it took for a stick of incense to burn. After Li Qingshan ran into the pill garden fields, he staggered, almost colliding with Su Fengyan. After being supported by Su Fengyan with a smile, the old Taoist smiled brightly, but there was a hint of self-mockery in his voice. Since it's my first time ascending and I've ascended to the high grade of the 18th grade, I thought I'd only ascend to the mid-grade at most. Even I found it rather difficult to control myself. It's mostly because of you. If I hadn't come, I wouldn't have been able to justify it. Su Fengyan bowed slightly. Congratulations on forging an immortal Taoist. Li Qingshan extended a finger and pointed at the top of his head. Let's cut to the chase. My superiors are watching. I'm treated as a living immortal in the human world, but I'm just a rash newcomer there. I'll have to act according to their mood. I've taken the liberty of coming here this time to say some last words to you. You can treat them as the last words of an immortal. After all, whether or not there will be any ascended immortals in the future is another matter altogether. Let's not talk about that. Su Fengyan, I'll ask you something. You just have to ask yourself. I have to leave after asking. I don't want to hear your answer. Su Fengyan answered politely, Please ask, Taoist. I'll think about it carefully. Li Qingshan straightened his face and asked sternly, Cultivators, attaining immortality and ascending to the ranks of immortals. Are you challenging the heavenly Tao? Practitioners of martial arts cultivate their bodies and maintain their health, prolonging their lives. Are you competing with the king of hell? Since both of them go against the common sense of heaven and earth, why are there still ascended celestials and level 1 experts? Su Fengyan couldn't help but laugh. Are you here as a lobbyist for this world? Li Qingshan shook his head. Think about it again. Just when Su Fengyan wanted to say something, Li Qingshan pointed at Su Fengyan's chest before vanishing in a flash. Afterwards, a pillar of light invisible to the world rose up from the ground, rushing into the clouds and breaking through the sky. Su Fengyan raised his head to look at the gradually dissipating light beam and the sea of clouds that remained in the sky. He suddenly remembered a kind of cultivation method on Mount Wudong that had been passed down for thousands of years and had been made public to the public. After ascending the mountain to cultivate, one would ask the heaven and earth. When one descended the mountain to cultivate, one would ask others. When one finally attained enlightenment, one would ask oneself. Cultivation was the truth. Su Fengyan began to realize that he seemed to have become far too busy after accompanying Su Xiao to meet the Empress of Beimang in the snowstorm. Moreover, this mental busyness was very self-absorbed. As a matter of fact, it was definitely not Su Xiao's original intentions. In the depths of his heart, Su Fengyan missed the Jianghu outside Beiliang. That had once been his childhood dream. He had once thought that it was the snowman he had compared to Shenyuan Qingfeng. Once it melted, it melted. He could not ask for it again. There were many people in the Jianghu who made Su Fengyan feel regret and guilt. Su Fengyan missed old Huang with a missing front tooth, the wanderer with a wooden sword, the old man with a sheepskin coat who was past his prime, Hong Shixiang who rode an ox, his eldest sister who had married off to a distant place in Jiangnan, and even the demon couple in the Duck's Head Green Inn. He missed the Beimang woman, Qing Junyang, who was constantly thinking about her dead daughter. There were many people in the Jianghu that he cared about, yet he could only watch on helplessly as they were separated from him, whether by life or death. There were many things that he had not done well. He could not stop old Huang from going to Martial Emperor City. He could not stop Wen Hua from being defeated in the Jianghu. He could not keep his eldest sister alive. He could not stop his second sister from sitting on the dragon throne, and he could not stop Sweet Potato from leaving Dunhuang City. As a result, Su Fengnian often felt that being the hereditary king of Beiliang was just a heavy burden that he could not escape from. It was not something that he truly wanted to do. Only now did Su Fengnian begin to think deeply about what he wanted to do after being asked by Li Qingshan. Su Fengnian gazed at the 9 heavens and said gently, "The heavenly path is a single plank bridge that only the heavens can walk on. The great path is a broad path that everyone in the secular world can walk on." He had no idea just how similar this sentence was to Li Yufu, who could make countless bolts of lightning roll through the world. In the end, Su Fengnian said to himself, "What do I want to do? It's so simple. I just want to be Su Zhao's son." Su Xiao gave so many desperate commoners a path of survival in the spring and autumn period. As his son, I want to guard this path. If anyone refuses, I'll make them agree. Sui Shigu, who had been waiting for a long time, rolled his eyes and said impatiently, "Kid, are you going to fight or not?" Su Fengnian smiled apologetically. He raised his hand and the Shudao sword emerged from its sheath. However, at this moment, a woman's voice suddenly rang out in everyone's ears. "Sui Shigu, get down here." Su Fengnian took pleasure in Sui Shigu's misfortune. He smiled and asked, "Old Senior Sui, are you going to fight or not?" Sui Shigu's expression stiffened. He gritted his teeth and said, "I'm going to fight. Why wouldn't I fight? Tantai Pingjing, there's no place for women to speak here." Su Fengnian restrained his smile and said, "It's fine." Li Chungang said that everything in the world is a matter of one sword. He glanced at the Shudao and said softly, "Go!" The ancient sword, Shudao, instantly disappeared. Sui Shigu suddenly raised his head. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "But this sword of mine is a bit too much." Almost at the same time, the 100 swords of the Wu family in Beiliang, Shenyuan Qingfeng, Luoyang, Su Ying, Tuoba, Deng Mao, the man who did not use a sword but carried a sword for his wife, the masters of the Beimang Chess and Sword Music School, Qi Shenxia, who was still traveling outside Mount Longhu, the Tongxi sword immortal Lu Baijie in the capital, the young Taoist Li Yufu who was rushing to Mount Wudong with his disciple Yufu, and Jiang Anai who was in a daze in the old capital of Da Chu, all raised their heads at the same time. Especially Jiang Anai, who hesitated and muttered to himself, "Borrow." The Wu family's sword tomb, Dongyue's sword pool, and the chess and sword music school were widely recognized as the places with the most swords in Jianghu. All the famous swords in the world flew into the sky to Beiliang. Chapter 1243. This was undoubtedly a marvelous scene. This was a scene that was destined to be passed down in Jianghu for a long time. The Suaxia Valley was almost instantly suppressed by tens of thousands of flying swords. Just a moment ago, the spectators outside the Pillseed field only felt that there were black clouds covering the sky and the sun. The next moment, those black clouds fell on the human world and filled the entire Pillseed field. The number of flying swords that broke through the air was so large that they were tightly packed together. Soon, the Suaxia Valley disappeared from everyone's sight. Other than swords, there were more swords. The young king of Beiliang seemed to have used a supernatural power that could move mountains and seas, creating a majestic and magnificent sword mountain out of thin air. At first, the sword mountain was still shaking visibly with the naked eye, but the shaking gradually decreased. With endless sword after sword, the sword mountain became taller and taller, and more stable until the entire mountain peak was completely motionless. Everyone outside the Pillseed field was dumbfounded. They had seen fights before, but they had never seen a fight like this. At this moment, the people who were not convinced that Su Fengnian had inexplicably become the most powerful person in the world were finally convinced. Even the pessimists who had no confidence in the imminent battle of Liangmang also felt that they should believe in Su Fengnian for once. Shudao was the last famous sword to fall, as if it was carelessly thrown to the top of the sword mountain by someone. The The sword mountain that was showing signs of loosening had completely lost its vitality. Occasionally, one or two slanted flying swords would slide down the sword mountain and fall outside the pill seed field. A tall woman standing far away under the eaves of a house on the street curled up the corners of her mouth. She glanced at the sword mountain that was more than 300 feet high and mocked. "I told you to scram, but you didn't. Your century-old reputation is destroyed in a day." Su Fengyan did not stand at the foot of the mountain, nor did he return to the carriage. Instead, he silently appeared under the same roof. The woman who was taller than him looked at him and saw that Su Fengyan's face was pale but radiant. Seemed contradictory, but in fact it was not. Tantai Pingjing saw it as a matter of course. Back then, her master was the same. His body was not strong, more like a weak scholar. However, her master's eyes were always as clean as the eyes of the young man in front of her. It was so clean that when her master pointed at the river python for her for the first time, she forgot to admire the white python that was about to transform. She only had eyes for her thin master. Even after decades, his master's catchphrase seemed to still ring in his ears. "Big fool." Staring at Su Fengyan, Tantai Ping smiled calmly, like a little girl who had gone through untold hardships to find her favorite object. Su Fengyan did not know the inside story. Instead, he felt a little creeped out. She was old, let alone a woman who was 100 years old. She suddenly showed such childish behavior. Even with Su Fengyan's thick skin and wisdom, he could not bear it. Su Fengyan, who wanted to chat, quickly swallowed back the words that were at the tip of his tongue. Tantai Pingjing's loss of composure quickly disappeared. She recovered the indifferent expression of the chief great-grandmaster of the Qi cultivators in the south. She shifted her gaze and said calmly, "What is the name of this sword move? Does it have a name?" Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Isn't giving a famous name to a move something that only the common people would do? Senior Tantai, do you also have such a tacky habit?" She said, "I also need to eat, drink, defecate, and sleep. I also know how to burp and fart. Why is it not tacky?" Back then, Su Fengyan advised Wen Hua not to be too infatuated with those unattainable heroines and fairies in the pugilistic world. This was because they also needed to defecate. Could it be that they could produce a flower by defecating? It was similar to Tantai Pingjing's self-mockery. But after all, this was the resentful words of beggar Su when he was in trouble. Now it was difficult to find joy in the midst of bitterness. Su Fengyan's mouth twitched. He smiled embarrassedly and said, "It's different. This is tacky and unbearable when others say it. But when it comes from Senior Tantai, it still sounds like a fairy." Tantai Pingjing looked past the crowd that still refused to disperse. She looked at the tens of thousands of swords piled up like a mountain and sighed, "Congratulations to the king of Bailiang for returning to the celestial being realm." Su Fengyan lowered his voice and said, "If one day—" She interrupted Su Fengyan and gave a straightforward answer, "I can lend it to you." Su Fengyan curled his lips. It was easy to talk to a smart person, but it was really boring. He rolled up his sleeves and looked at the magnificent sword mountain with Tantai Pingjing. It was supposed that only the master of all the swords in the world could move here. He thought of some past events. A long, long time ago he liked to carry swords and sabers, but they were just embroidered pillows. She had a divine talisman, but it was not much better. Su Fengyan couldn't help but sigh. Tantai Pingjing asked, "When will we go to the border of Liangzhou to supervise the war?" Su Fengyan said slowly, "In a few days. Let's wait for the Golden Thread Weaving Bureau to send the new king's robe here first." Chapter 1244. With the Pill Garden as the center, Liangzhou City was so congested that not even a drop of water could trickle through. Because the battle had ended too quickly, many people outside only saw the scene of flying swords falling like rain. They did not know that the battle had already ended, so they continued to fight their way to the Pill Garden. This made it impossible for a large group of spectators to leave. It could be said that most of the residents of Liangzhou City had either arrived or were on their way to watch the battle. It was more lively than the New Year. Bailiang was not like Great Peace City, where people would turn out every few days. However, this was a rare occasion. The martial artists of Bailiang had been suppressed by the army. It was not easy for the king of Bailiang to personally come out and compete with someone. Plus, he was the #1 in the world. Even the calmest people of Liangzhou could not help but be moved. In the vast sea of people about half a mile away from the Pill Garden, there was a pair of women who had completely opposite personalities but had extraordinary statuses. The two of them looked at each other. They were Song Huangmei, the only daughter of Song Yan of Lingzhou, and Li Fuzhen, the daughter of the administrator Li Gongda. Li Fuzhen did not want to join in the fun at first. However, she could not endure the pestering of Song Huangmei, who liked to play with swords and sabers, so she reluctantly came. As a result, the carriage was blocked halfway. With Song Huangmei's liveliness, she jumped onto the roof of the carriage without saying anything. Li Fuzhen stood behind the coachman and did not miss the scene of the flying swords falling down. Song Huangmei, who stood on the roof of the carriage, waited for a long time. She did not see the result of the flying swords on the sword mountain flying away. She was both shocked and disappointed. She jumped to Li Fuzhen's side, her face full of desire. She clicked her tongue and said, "How was it? We didn't come in vain, right? How soul-stirring. If you didn't come, you would regret it to death." Li Fuzhen's expression was indifferent. Song Huangmei was not surprised. She clenched her fist and slammed it into the palm of her other hand. She said to herself, "No, I have to be that guy's disciple and learn martial arts. Even if I have to serve him tea and water every day, it's not a big deal. If I don't take such a top-notch expert as my master, isn't it a waste of God's gift?" Li Fuzhen wanted to say something but stopped. Song Huangmei looked at her with a pitiful face and begged, "Sister Fuzhen, my good sister, I know that you and that guy are childhood sweethearts. Your words are more useful than mine. Why don't you help me?" Li Fuzhen glared at him and said, "I advise you to give up." Li Fuzhen turned her head slightly and said coldly, "He and I have never seen eye to eye." Song Huangmei said with a mischievous smile, "It's better to squash enmity than to keep it alive. Moreover, it's fate for men and women to become enemies." Li Fuzhen snorted coldly. "That's also an ill-fated relationship." Song Huangmei rolled his eyes. Seeing that this path was not going to work, he just wanted to earn his own living. He racked his brains to think of a way to sneak into the prince's mansion on Mount Qingliang. In order to practice swordsmanship with him, he would just let the image of a lady from a respectable family go with the wind. At this moment, Li Fuzhen's mind was wandering thousands of miles away. Her mind was not focused. The situation in Bailiang could be said to be changing rapidly. Following Li Gongda's appointment as the deputy administrator, the officials in Bailiang knew that this year might be the last year that Li Gongda would be the top civil official. Furthermore, at that time, the administrator's performance in the military and political changes in Lingzhou was not satisfactory. Although he gave birth to a good son and was still closely related to the Su family, it was a rule since ancient times that a new emperor would bring in new officials. Furthermore, the situation now was not a smooth time for him to become a Taiping official. Sir Li, who had a mediocre reputation, might not be able to keep his position with the million-strong army of Beimang. As a result, the Lingzhou administrator's mansion, which was much less noisy than it had been a few years ago, became more and more deserted. The new and old people in the officialdom all ran over to provincial governor Su Beiji and Song Yan's side to get familiar with each other. Li Fuzhen had never paid much attention to the ups and downs of the officialdom. However, as his father grew older and did not have any younger children to play with, he spent his days at home dealing with flowers, fish, and insects. Li Fuzhen did not know if it was because his father's addiction to being an official had suddenly disappeared, or if he had accepted his fate. However, Li Fuzhen was still more used to his father, who spent every day exchanging pleasantries and playing tricks with officials. Every day he was full of fighting spirit. Every day he knew who he should meet the next day and what to say. He was not like now, leisurely passing his days and being a rich and idle old man. Li Fuzhen felt an impulse for no reason. "If I beg you for the first time, will you agree to let my father be the Bailiang administrator for a few more years?" Li Fuzhen laughed self-mockingly and shook his head. Li Fuzhen, Why would you have such a ridiculous and funny idea? Song Huangmei understood the character of this elder sister Fuzhen. When she was stubborn, even 9 oxen and 2 tigers could not pull her back. Therefore, he gave up on the idea of asking her to recommend him. Song Huangmei laughed and approached Li Fuzhen. Elder sister Fuzhen, I have always been very curious. Why did the administrator give you such a strange name? It is even rarer than me. What is Fu? What is Zhen? Li Fuzhen was stunned for a moment. This question really stumped her. She had never thought deeply about her name. She had always thought that perhaps it was the famous Fu and the innocent Zhen. Perhaps her father wanted her to be carefree for the rest of her life. Song Huangmei saw that she was silent and did not bother to get to the bottom of it. He said to himself, I have always heard that the guy once invited Jinwu Great Emperor to come to the Spring God Lake. With one punch, he destroyed the first Grandmaster of Mount Longhu invited by the little celestial master Zhao Ningxian. In the past, I thought that there were no immortals in the world. Now I feel that it is really hard to say. Speaking of this, Song Huangmei laughed and said, Elder sister Fuzhen, there is also the word Zhen in Jinwu Great Emperor. Jinwu? Li Fuzhen laughed. Then, suddenly, she could not laugh anymore. There was a word called lianying. Chapter 1245. Hundreds of elite cavalry from Lingzhou escorted the 3 carriages into Liangzhou city. The person at the front was Lingzhou Deputy General Han Laozhan. Looking at his armor, he was also one of the most powerful officers in Beiliang. This made the commoners who saw this scene click their tongues in wonder. They did not know who or what it was that made the Lingzhou military mobilize so many people, emptying half of the military officers in Lingzhou in an instant. Among the group of horses, there was one person who stood out. More accurately, he was like a chicken standing out from a flock of cranes. Among the large group of horses, cold swords, armor, and sharp spears, only this person was wearing the uniform of a civil official. He was escorting the carriage at the front. From time to time, he would glance at the window. His eyes were filled with pride, which was exactly what Su Weisheng had said when he was young. He was the head of the Golden Weaving Bureau Wang Lifting. This time, he rushed to Beiliang Palace not because of the Weaving Bureau, but because this young family head of the Purple Gold Wang family had done a beautiful job. He was worthy of Lingzhou Deputy General Han Laozhan being at his beck and call. Inside the 3 carriages, there was no gold or silver, nor was there any auspicious sign to pay tribute to Qingliang Mountain. There were only 3 pieces of clothing. After the Golden Weaving Bureau changed owners, Wang Lifting focused on this matter. In the other territories of the Liang dynasty, the position of weaving officer was just a secret agent with a rank. They were the eyes and ears of the emperor. They had the privilege of sending a secret letter to the imperial study. Wang Lifting was a weaving official who was promoted by Northern Liang after Li Shifeng retired and returned to his hometown. She had nothing to do with the talented and resourceful son of the Zhao family. Wang Lifting, other than closely monitoring the Jianghu factions in Lingzhou, especially the rise of the Fish Dragon Gang, he was more of a weaving officer, doing the work of mending clothes. In the front carriage, there were 3 women. The oldest woman was not more than 30 years old. There was a small purple sandalwood box in the carriage. The youngest woman had a graceful figure and an outstanding appearance. Although she was wearing a woman's uniform made of ice, the details showed her thoughts. Her face was painted with a suitable shade of yume, and the stone used to draw her eyebrows was purchased from Xinyang Zhai, which was known as Lingzhou's women's money-squandering brothel. On her wrist was a disc-shaped carved fish jade pendant that symbolized good luck. At first glance, this woman could tell that she came from a wealthy family. Compared to the other 2 women with few accessories, she was worlds apart. However, this rich woman always talked and laughed with the older woman, but she made things difficult for the woman with the surname Su. Of course, these tricks were all under the table and would not be disliked by others. The young woman did not know why she was so hostile towards the poor widow. No matter how she looked at her, she did not feel comfortable. Perhaps it was because the Su family's woman's chest was even more bumpy than hers. Or perhaps it was because she was clearly a country bumpkin with a son, but she was more popular with men than she was in the Golden Weaving Bureau. It was just like one of the weaving officer's confidants who was blind and fell in love with this woman at first sight. It was as if he had been bewitched. He even rejected the marriage that his family had agreed on, saying that he would not marry anyone other than the Su family's woman. He even said that as long as the woman nodded, he was willing to marry her officially. He did not mind her past and would even treat her son as his own. It was not just this scholar who had wasted 20 years of studying. There was also a general in Lingzhou who was about to become a military officer in his early 30s. His future was bright, and his guests were either county governors or generals. What kind of good match could he not find? He was also shocked. This made the young woman in the carriage angry at the injustice of the world. The vixen with the surname Su had a rustic aura. Although her appearance was outstanding, it was not all that stunning. Could it be that she was a spirit that had walked out of the deep mountains and forests? Otherwise, why would all those men go crazy for her? She glanced at the woman who was silently criticizing the vixen Su. Then she smiled at the older woman and said, "Sister Song, when I was young, I heard my father say that he had once gone to Mount Qingliang. At that time, he was going hand in hand with County Governor Liu to participate in our little prince's birthday celebration. My father also said that the general had personally come down from his seat and drank a cup of green ant wine with them." The older woman smiled and agreed. "Zhao, who doesn't know that your father is the god of wealth in Lingzhou? It is a good thing for him to go to the prince's estate. Zhao, your literary talent is good. This time, if you go to Mount Qingliang with official Wang, you might catch the prince's eye and accidentally become one of the popular female scholars in Wutong'an. When that time comes, don't forget about Sister Song." The young woman who was nicknamed Zhao covered her mouth and smiled. Borrowing Sister's auspicious words, the female scholar really does not dare to have extravagant hopes. It would be a great fortune for Zhao to be that prince's maidservant. The young woman who had left her home to join the weaving bureau, Su Qing, had a faint expression. She did not want to participate in the conversation between the two women beside her. In reality, she still did not know how she had been chosen by the Yuzhou government as a female embroiderer. She had been chosen along with a dozen other women who were clever and skilled in their hands. She had then gone to the rich and fertile Lingzhou, which had the reputation of being a little Jiangnan. She could only explain that she had been in her hometown at Tumbling Horse Pass when she had the time to sew some personal items for the women of the Yuzhou government officials. That was how she had this inexplicable opportunity. In reality, she was not very willing to go to the distant Lingzhou at first. Her son, Yusong, was still young. Although their family did not have much farmland, it could not be delayed. The countryside had always been like this. If there was less sweat, there would be less harvest. God's eyes were very sharp. However, the village's village chief said that this was a great honor for Zhao village. As long as she went to the Lingzhou Weaving Bureau, not only would the village exempt Yusong's tuition fees from the private school, they would also ask the neighbors to help take care of her family's crops. Yusong could even stay with the teacher. This was a great thing. Even so, without any worries, Su Qing still asked Yusong. The child was sensible. Although he loved his mother, he patted his chest and said it was fine. His mother could go to Lingzhou and he could take care of himself. He also promised that when his mother came back, he would be able to recite the 300,000 by heart. Thinking of her sensible child, Su Qing's heart warmed and the corners of her mouth curled up. Zhao glanced at the woman's smile from the corner of her eyes and felt hatred in her heart. This Su Qing's appearance was just like that. But it was this kind of silent charm that could seduce men. It was not that she did not want to learn, but she could not learn. In the end, she could only resentfully give up. Out of sight, out of mind, Zhao said proudly to the average-looking Sister Song. "Sister Song, of the 3 python robes and phoenix robes that were made by the Weaving Bureau, the python robe is naturally for our prince to wear. The other 2 should be for the 2 Wangfei. My father once drank and chatted merrily with a head steward of the Liu family. At the beginning of the year, that steward privately said that the young miss of their family might not be able to become the main wife. However, 1 main wife and 3 side concubines have always been a long-standing rule in the Liyang sect. Even if the young miss of the Liu family isn't the main wife, she would still be the first of the side concubines. The young miss of the Spring God Lake Wang family is ranked behind her. Sister Song, it's fine if you've heard this before, but you can't tell anyone else. There will be big trouble. The older woman knew that no matter how small the matters of the imperial family were, they were still more important than the monstrous matters of the common people. How could she dare to carelessly gossip about such a secret? Hearing this, she was startled and became even more respectful towards Zaoer, who was technically her subordinate. She thought to herself that in the past, she would occasionally put on airs in front of Zaoer. On this trip to the prince's estate, shouldn't she be a little more careful to mend the pen after the sheep were lost? The specifications of the Golden Silk Weaving Bureau were roughly the same as the other major weaving bureaus of the Liang dynasty. Among the 3 major workshops, other than the silk machine room, the other 2 workshops were exactly the same. There were more than 600 people in total and more than 400 looms, such as her, who were registered in the Weaving Bureau, and temporary residents like Su Qing, who were recruited temporarily. The chief weaving official, Wang Lifting, was said to be the new Prince Liang's favorite. She didn't know whether this was true or not, but the local yamen of Lingzhou and the Fish Dragon Gang didn't dare to not give Lord Wang some face. As a result, the Weaving Bureau was able to obtain benefits from both sides. This made her, a small official in the silk workshop, feel honored. She was no longer like before, when Li Shifeng was in charge of the Weaving Bureau, where no one cared about him or loved him. The reason why she didn't ostracize Su Qing like Zaoer was because she had a secret hidden in her heart. She had once seen Lord Wang reprimanding someone in a secluded place from afar. It had to be known that the person being reprimanded was a military officer who held half of the county's military power. The military officer's son, who had an excellent reputation, was slightly older than Lord Wang. At first, he wanted to retort, but after Lord Wang said something, she saw the military officer's expression change drastically. When the military officer, who usually walked with a swagger, left, she looked like a frosted eggplant. She felt like she had lost her soul. From then on, the military officer never came to the Golden Silk Weaving Bureau to pester the young widow, Su Qing. She secretly guessed that the young woman, Su Qing, was either a lucky woman who Wang Lifting himself kept as a mistress in a golden house, or she was the exclusive property of some great figure behind the scenes in Lingzhou. Otherwise, she really couldn't understand who had the ability to send a rural woman from the border of Yuzhou to the popular Lingzhou Weaving Bureau and receive a unique double salary. The key was that Su Qing still didn't know the truth. She always thought that she was treated the same as other female craftsmen. Chapter 1246. Su Qing, who was sitting upright and still, took advantage of the time when the 2 women were chatting to sneakily stretch out a finger. Her fingertip lightly brushed across the sandalwood box. It was only after she entered the Weaving Bureau that she learned that there were some pieces of wood in the world that were more valuable than human lives. She had never understood the ways of the world. She thought that after completing this task, she would muster up the courage to speak to the master swordsman in her silk workshop and ask if she could take a leave of absence to go home and see her children and check on the harvest in the fields. For some reason, Su Qing thought of the clothes in the 3 boxes. It was really shocking. When the master had finished, he had said to Weaving Wang that according to the normal process and manpower of the Jiangnan Weaving Bureau, not to mention the 3 boxes, just the python robe that the Prince of Northern Liang was going to wear would take 3 years. Moreover, they might not be able to do it better than the Golden Weaving Bureau. Su Qing had no doubts about this. She had personally participated in the process and knew better than anyone else how difficult it was. There were dozens of people involved in each process, from the master to the lowest craftsman. Almost everyone had to work for more than 16 hours a day. Therefore, the Weaving Bureau was brightly lit every night. Her hand had been pricked hundreds of times before she lost count of the number of times. That python robe, which came from the dragon painting master, had 9 sketches. Each one was lifelike and intimidating. She had only seen the one that had been selected. She didn't even dare to look at the python dragon in the painting. She only felt that it was on the verge of spitting out clouds and smoke from the sketches. Su Qing was one of the many gardeners. This python robe was the most precious makeup flower in the Yunjin brocade. It had reached an unprecedented number of 1,800 flowers. Furthermore, if one was picked incorrectly, the entire effort would be wasted and they would have to start all over again. Previously, there was a female craftsman who had a good relationship with Su Qing. Because she picked incorrectly, Weaving Wang, who had rushed over after hearing the news, had ordered people to beat her to death. At the time, Su Qing did not care and pleaded for mercy for her. She only did what she could and left the rest to fate. Unexpectedly, the female craftsman escaped the disaster, but she also lost her position as an official craftsman and was expelled from the weaving bureau. The clever Su Qing had made an exception for the 3 pieces of clothing. In particular, the black robe embroidered with golden pythons had 18 golden pythons. After it was completed, it was truly a rare, noble item in the world. Even a village girl like Su Qing, who considered herself ignorant and inexperienced, dared to say that other than His Majesty, who sat on the dragon throne in Great Peace City, there was no other king in the world whose python robe could compare to it. As for the 2 pieces of the future king of Beiliang's wedding dress, Su Qing did not have much thoughts. She was not like Zhao who would be swayed at first glance and fantasize about how good it would be if she herself wore it. The caravan drove straight in and arrived at the foot of Mount Qingliang. Wang Lifting felt relieved. This time, there were more than 20 people accompanying the weaving bureau, but not everyone was lucky enough to enter the royal residence to broaden their horizons. There were 3 carriages, 3 chests, and 3 pieces of clothing. In each carriage, there were 3 female craftsmen guarding the red sandalwood chests. Wang Lifting had already planned that each carriage could only have 1 woman to try on the clothes for the king of Beiliang and the 2 future princesses of the Lu and Wang families. The python robe was undoubtedly of the utmost importance. The female craftsman called Situ Huazao had her father use countless favors and a full 6,000 taels of silver to beg an expert to help her. Wang Lifting smiled coldly. She wanted to dress the king of Beiliang with just this? After Wang Lifting dismounted, he called out the names of the 2 carriages that would be responsible for carrying the chests into the residence. The 2 women who were called out were so excited that their eyes immediately filled with tears. Their family backgrounds were clean, their appearances were delicate, and their personalities had always been honest. They were definitely not shrewd women who would do something superfluous. Wang Lifting was very confident in them. Then, on the side of the first carriage, Wang Lifting, the Lord of Weaving, looked meaningfully at the unknown Su Qing. He extended a finger and pointed at her, but did not say anything else. Su Qing was stunned on the spot. She had always thought that Situ Huazao, the proud daughter of heaven, would be the one to try on the clothes for the young king of Beiliang. She had never thought that it would be her. For a moment, she was at a loss. Wang Lifting frowned. If it had been anyone else, he would have been furious. But since it was her, Wang Lifting was unusually patient. He glanced lightly at Su Qing and stopped to wait for her. The reason for this was because Wang Lifting knew more. This young widow's background was very simple, but the man behind the scenes who had single-handedly sent her into Wang Lifting's territory was someone that even he, the head of the Golden Weavers, could not afford to offend. Yozhou's General Huang Fuchang. This man was truly worthy of being called the king of Beiliang's trusted aide. Wang Lifting, compared to this man who was famous for his ruthlessness in Beiliang, was willing to concede defeat, whether in terms of the maturity of his official cultivation or the degree of his viciousness and mercilessness. Wang Lifting had always thought that the young widow at Tuma Pass in Yanji County was the woman that Huang Fuchang had taken a fancy to. Thus, he did not hesitate to pinch his nose and treat her with courtesy. Wang Lifting naturally did not know that when the Yuzhou general saw this young widow, he did not dare to be the slightest bit rude. Su Qing braced herself. She carried the not-so-heavy sandalwood chest and followed the crowd into the prince's residence in a muddle-headed state. Along the way, Su Qing forgot to take a look at the world-famous Tidehark Lake. In the past, when people in the weaving bureau talked about the lake, they would always be full of longing. They would use hearsay and exaggeration to describe the scene of thousands of carps swimming in the Tidehark Lake. Wang Lifting slowly ascended the mountain. First, he brought the 2 chests to the entrance of 2 elegant and quiet courtyards. Finally, under the lead of the head butler, he walked to an extremely inconspicuous courtyard that was even higher up. It was not Wutangen. It was the residence of the old Prince Liang, Su Shao. Even the mentally tough Wang Lifting was shocked. Wang Lifting let out a long breath and whispered, Su Qing, do things cleverly and naturally. If you are really nervous, I can let you stay outside the courtyard for a while. You can go in when your limbs are not stiff. Su Qing's face was pale. She hugged the chest. After hearing the weaving bureau's words, she became even more nervous and showed signs of tears. The person inside was the king of Bailiang. She had never even seen a high-ranking official like the county magistrate in her life. How could she not be nervous? Wang Lifting looked at her uneasiness and felt a little vexed. If she had known earlier, she would have let Situ Huazhao carry the box. In any case, that woman's ambition was not small and her courage was not small. She would not be so timid. As for her uneasiness, it was nothing in this mansion where the father and son of the Liang dynasty had different surnames. The head butler leading the way was still smiling. He did not even have the slightest intention of urging them. But Wang Lifting was familiar with the ways of the world and knew very well that he had been implicated by Su Qing. If he wanted to enter Mount Qingliang in the future, unless he was summoned by the king of Bailiang, it would be as difficult as ascending to the heavens. The head butler would not argue with the woman. But in the heart of this well-deserved Bailiang bigwig, just as Wang Lifting had expected, he had a bad impression of Wang Lifting's purple gold Wang family and the entire golden weaving bureau. Wang Lifting looked at Su Qing's increasing panic and sighed in his heart. The head butler narrowed his eyes and glanced at the young weaving official, then turned to the woman and smiled warmly. Miss, it's fine. Our prince is the most easygoing person in the world. Don't worry and go in. It doesn't matter if you do something wrong. Why don't we make a bet? If His Highness speaks harshly to you, when you come out, I will give you 10 taels of silver. If His Highness is really, as I said, very easy to talk to, miss, you will have to give me 10 taels of silver. How about it? Su Qing finally relaxed. She bit her lip and nodded. She was no longer at a loss as to where to put her hands and feet. The head butler smiled and helped push open the courtyard door. He waited for her to step over the threshold before gently closing the door. Then, Su Qing saw the back of a young man standing alone under a loquat tree that was still green in autumn. The loquat tree was lonely. He was also lonely. Su Qing was stunned. She blinked, thinking that her eyes were playing tricks on her. After blinking hard, she still felt that it was inconceivable. Why was his figure so similar to the young master who had passed through Tumbling Horse Pass twice? That person turned around. Su Qing immediately felt relieved. But when she saw his eyes, she was on tenterhooks. Their appearances were not the same person, but their eyes and eyes were too similar. Su Qing was completely stunned. She knew that the young vassal king in front of her was destined not to be that person. But at this moment, she thought of that person at an inappropriate time. She really missed him. Little Miss Su Qing knew that she should not be like this. But she was like this. Su Fengyan was also stunned for a moment, but he quickly figured out the reason. It was definitely Huang Fucheng's superfluous action. But since it had come to this, he did not want to say anything more. Walking in front of her, he took the chest and said indifferently, "This king can wear his own clothes. You just have to wait in the courtyard. After the time it takes to burn a stick of incense, leave. Tell Wang Lifting outside the door that this king said that the python robe was not bad. Also, tell him not to be in a hurry to leave the mansion." Su Qing nodded blankly. He did not know if she understood. Su Fengyan turned around and smiled. As he was walking up the steps, he suddenly heard a timid shout from behind him. It was definitely the most courageous shout the woman had ever made in her life. "Young Master Su?" He did not stop walking. Her face was red, and she was sweating profusely. A few strands of hair stuck to her cheeks. She raised her arm and secretly wiped them. She smiled happily. It was not him. It would be good if it was not him. If it was not him, they might meet again. She still owed him money. He said it was 1,500 taels of silver, and she had to pay it back in 50 years. She was not willing to admit that she agreed to go to the Golden Silk Weaving Bureau because she heard him say that he was a scholar traveling in Lingzhou. Inside the room, the light was dim. Su Fengyan put on the python robe that was obviously made by the Yu dynasty. Fit very well, just like the one Su Shao wore back then. Chapter 1247. In the dead of the night, a majestic group of horses quietly galloped out of the north gate of Liangzhou city. Among them were the 800 white horse followers who had followed the new Prince Yi, the 100 or so swordsmen of the Wu family who had just arrived at Liangzhou, and a dozen or so qi cultivators from the Guanyin sect of the South Sea. The leader of the group was the current leader of Beiliang, Su Fengyan, Wu Luding and Cui Hua, the pair of sword attendants, Tantai Pingjing, the head of the qi cultivators in the south, and the sickly old swordsman with white eyebrows, Sui Shiegu. However, the one who rode alongside Su Fengyan was not the aforementioned people. It was Su Beiji, who was supposed to be in charge of government affairs in Lingzhou. Su Fengyan did not care about Zhu Zi's sudden arrival. He was more than happy. During the day, there were some hidden rumors from Mount Qingliang. It was said that when the provincial governor came to the residence, the prince personally carried the basin. When the provincial governor washed his face, the prince even smiled. This confused the people in the residence. Should they say that the prince was courteous, or should they say that Su Beiji, the young governor of the border, was too popular? Anyway, the northern barbarian, Su Beiji, as the grandson of the king of the northern courtyard, Su Huainan, had a sensitive identity. However, he was able to rise up the ranks in Beiliang. Outsiders could only see the flowers in the fog. Su Beiji brought a piece of terrible news. He thought that the remnants of Western Shu, led by the crown prince, Su Su, had caused Beiliang's plans to go down the drain. They even helped the king of Shu, Chun Jibao, become more arrogant. In Su Beiji's words, it was like Beiliang had finally fattened up a watchdog. Not only would he not be able to eat meat, but he would also not be able to guard Beiliang's gate. He might even bite back in the future. Su Fengyan was rather calm about this. When he first found Su Su and this old man's son, Zhao Dingxiu, in a small town in Beimang, he did not have much hope after interacting with him. Firstly, Su Su was too lazy. If he was in Jianghu, he might do his best. However, if he was asked to go to the temple and scheme, he believed that Su Su would not hesitate if he could quit. Relying on this kid to revive Western Shu was more disappointing than relying on him, His Royal Highness, to carry the flag for Beiliang. It was simply hopeless. Furthermore, Zhao Dingxiu was half an imperial tutor. As long as he could revive his country, it did not matter who helped him. The relationship between Beiliang and Su Fengyan was not enough for Zhao Dingxiu to disregard the big picture and wrestle with Chun Jibao. When all was said and done, the emperor of the Zhao clan had sent Zhao Kai to the western regions with the intention of cutting off the connection between Beiliang and Shu Zhao before forming a huge arc encirclement with the three western regions. Unfortunately, he was intercepted by Su Fengyan and failed at the Iron Gate. However, when Chun Jibao entered Shu and was conferred the title of king, he inherited the strategic plan of the Northwest. Although Su Fengyan took advantage of this opportunity to win over the sixth jewel master and started to infiltrate the western regions, Chun Jibao quickly returned the favor and sat in western Shu while looking at southern Zhao. Could be said that both sides won and lost in this battle. However, to Great Peace City, which was watching from the other side, it was a win for them. Without Shu Zhao, which could allow Beiliang to retreat, Beiliang was equivalent to an extended strategic location. Even if the battle was tight, they could only fight to the death until the Su family's accumulated resources in Su Zhao's hands were exhausted. However, if he only wanted to make Su Fengyan angry, Su Beiji wouldn't have personally come to Mount Qingliang. The Lingzhou provincial governor's urgent audience came with a draft regarding the reform of the Beiliang's military. Previously, Su Fengyan listened to Chun Shiliang's suggestion and carried out a series of sweeping and decisive actions to clean up the accumulated abuses in the Beiliang army. A large number of captains and miscellaneous generals who were as numerous as the hairs on an ox were all fired. This made the originally unremarkable position of captains in the three provinces of Liang, Yuling, and Lingzhou become a powerful martial arts club that was only second to the three generals of a province. Then, he took back a large number of miscellaneous generals who were originally meant for the meritorious officials to retire at home. This shook the foundation of many of the general families in Beiliang. After the older generation of generals withdrew from the border, the titles that they wanted to pass down to their descendants as family heirlooms were swept into the trash basket of history. Most of the family's descendants had never personally accomplished anything. This created an invisible gap, because the firewood for a family's torch was taken away. Su Beiji said that in times of peace, whether Mount Qingliang robbed the rich to help the poor or even killed the goose that laid the golden eggs, it wouldn't affect the Su family's position in Beiliang. However, right now, they were at a critical juncture where Beimang's million-strong army was pressing down on the border. Whether or not the general families were willing to contribute, they had to fight for it. After leaving Liangzhou, Su Fengyan didn't interrupt from beginning to end. It was always Su Beiji who spoke tirelessly about the pros and cons. Su Fengyan wasn't someone who couldn't listen to opinions, but he was indeed a bit troubled. To be more precise, he had difficulties that he couldn't speak of. If it had been anyone else who brought up this matter, Su Fengyan would have accepted it without hesitation. However, since it was Su Beiji who brought it up, Su Fengyan had to think carefully. Su Beiji didn't mind Su Fengyan's silence. He continued to talk about the general framework of Beiliang's army in his mind. The border army doesn't need to draw legs on a snake. Just follow the old rules and do things. The local officers, both old and new, are also clear about their duties. However, right now, Beiliang needs more people who are willing to fight on the battlefield. In the Battle of Liangmang, Beiliang was slightly better than Beimang in terms of leading soldiers. In terms of bravery, Beiliang had the upper hand. However, the more this is the case, the more we can't lose too much to Beiliang in terms of tenacity. Our Beiliang can't win 10 battles or dozens of battles only to lose everything because of one big battle. Chapter 1248. Su Beiji's eyes were resolute as he said in a low voice, Beiliang's foundation is not strong enough to begin with. Now, the general families who have no hope of defending their positions are rushing to leave Beiliang. It's true that most of these people are vermin, but can't they really become part of Beiliang's fighting force? The battle between countries has always been about who can endure more and who can take more hits. According to my plan, Beiliang will have the titles of 3 great military generals. These 12 titles are destined to be given to the outstanding people of the border army who have made great contributions in battle. However, there will be 12 ranks of military generals in the ranks of colonel, and cavalry. There will also be 2 great civil generals. These titles will be tailor-made for the wavering spectators, for the general families who are willing to contribute money and effort, and for the scholars who are willing to come up with ideas. Of course, you have to ensure that these titles are recognized by the Liang Imperial Court. If possible, you have to ask the Great Peace City's Ministry of War for an edict to announce to the world. You have to ask the Zhao family's emperor and the Ministry of War and Ministry of Personnel not only to recognize the various ranks of Beiliang, but also to promise that any Beiliang official who wishes to leave the country can be demoted by 1 or 2 ranks. They cannot use any excuse to refuse. Su Fengyan laughed bitterly and said, Zhu Zi, do you really think that the Great Peace City's Ministry of War is a small courtyard in my house? Although my relationship with Liu Baijie is not bad, I'm sure that Sword Immortal Tang she will fall to the ground when she receives the edict. Right now, in order to suppress the local powers, even old generals like Yan Jinchuan and Yang Xinxing can be sent to their deaths. How can they slap their own mouths? When the time comes, they will take care of Beiliang. If Gu Jiantang wants to demand an exorbitant price, do you think the Ministry of War and the person on the dragon throne will agree? Su Beiji shook his head decisively and said, It's not the same. The Zhao family can't even fend for themselves. Right now, they're relying on Beiliang to fight to the death with Beimang. If we submit this report, we'll have a 50% chance of success. Su Fengyan also shook his head and sighed. It's not that we can't send the memorial, but you have to know that last time we relied on Song Dongming's suggestion that Beiliang send troops to pacify the Guangling Path, and the imperial court had already reluctantly sent over the grain. I don't think it's going to happen this time. Su Beiji loosened his grip on the reins and rubbed his hands. He said softly, The memorial isn't going to be sent to the Ministry of War right now. Let's see when Chao Chongqing will be able to beat up the imperial court. Su Fengyan nodded and suddenly asked, Do you know what I'm thinking? Su Beiji turned to look at him and asked calmly, Are you afraid that Chen Shiliang and I are like fire and water? Both of us think that a mountain can't accommodate 2 tigers? Su Fengyan let out a sigh of relief and said jokingly, It's good that you know what you're doing. The 2 of you are both my friends and my master's precious unpolished jade. If either of you is gone, I'll die of heartache. Su Beiji also asked, do you know what I'm thinking? Su Fengyan rolled his eyes and said, you can read my mind, but I can't read yours. Su Beiji didn't attack Su Fengyan like he usually did. Instead, he said, I think that once Liang Mang starts the war, we have to find a reason to not give Gu Jiantang the opportunity to sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight on the eastern front. Su Fengyan froze and said, not only does this touch you on Bunxi's bottom line, I'm afraid that even Zhang Julu and Qi Yonglong won't agree. Su Beiji said calmly, even Wang Xianji will lose. There shouldn't be anyone in the world who can win every battle. Su Fengyan was speechless. This was probably the biggest difference between Su Beiji and Chen Shiliang. When Chen Shiliang did things, he always liked to start from the smallest details. Very rarely did he make a move that gave off the feeling of being bold. But Su Beiji was different. He seemed to have a higher vantage point and was more insightful. But there was no difference between the two. At least that was the case for now. Su Beiji smiled for no reason. Su Fengyan looked at this guy in confusion. Under the moonlight, Su Beiji looked to the north and said softly with a smile, when I was young, I always wanted to go south with my grandfather and fight Beiliang. I didn't expect it to be the other way around. Su Fengyan asked curiously, you really don't have anyone in Norland that you care about? For example, do you have a girl you grew up with? Are there any good men who share the same interests? Are there any bastards who you want to ride on top of his head to vent your anger? Su Beiji's face was calm as she replied softly, no. A plan could be worth a city, and a few words could set the foundation of a country. Su Fengyan was waiting to see who would become the first strategist in Beiliang to be worthy of such a title. At this time, one of the 100 swords of the Wu family sped up and passed by Wu Luding and the female sword attendant. He came to Su Fengyan's side and cupped his fists. He said loudly, I am Xie Qinggan, from a fallen country. If I may be so bold as to ask, would your highness be willing to spar with me when you are free? Su Fengyan smiled and said, is it for yourself or for Western Shu? Xie Qinggan, who had once lost to the sword emperor of Western Shu by half a sword, said honestly, both. Su Fengyan pulled on the reins of his horse and rubbed salt on the wound of an old swordsman. He said lazily, Senior Sui, someone wants to spar with me. Shouldn't they ask you first? It was indeed Su Fengyan's latest defeated opponent, Sui Xiegu. He was so angry that his white eyebrows fluttered. He snorted coldly but did not refuse. The haggard Xie Qinggan said calmly, I know that I am not your highness's opponent, but if I don't use this sword in my life, my conscience will not be at ease. Cui Hua, who was resting with her eyes closed, asked coldly, Xie Qinggan, after entering the tomb, do you have any sword of your own to speak of? Xie Banjian's expression suddenly dimmed. He wanted to speak but stopped. Wu Luding laughed and said, it's fine. Since we have left that lifeless place, we don't have to pay too much attention to those rules and regulations. Grandfather Xie said it was a spar, not a life and death battle. I believe that the king of Beiliang is magnanimous. If we don't fight when we are in an invincible position, it would be unreasonable. That's right. Su Fengyan turned his head and looked at the sword crown of the Wu family, who he had never dealt with. All right, let's spar too. Wu Luding snorted and said angrily, afraid of you? You pick the place, I pick the time. Su Fengyan said, right here. Wu Luding said shamelessly, 100 years later. Most of the Wu family's swordsmen had strange expressions on their faces. To have such a young master as their leader was really a disgrace. A middle-aged swordsman also sped up his horse and asked with a smile, I heard that the king of Beiliang started practicing with the blade? Su Fengyan asked with a smile, what, you, Zhang Wantai? Lost to Gu Jiantang in the peak battle in front of the Wu family's sword tomb. And now you want to get back at me, who also practices the blade? Zhang Luantai was also honest. He nodded and said, I think so, but it is as difficult as ascending to the heavens. The beautiful swordsman Wu Luding called Auntie Nalan did not go up to join in the fun, but cleared her throat and asked with a laugh, Wang Yi, I will not seek humiliation by competing with you. I just want to ask a small question. Wang Yi, you are so handsome. If I were 10 or 20 years younger, would we be able to live together? Su Fengyan turned his head and said with a smile, Sister, how about you be the wet nurse for my children in the future? The woman's chest rose and fell with the movement of the horse's back. Her aura was turbulent. After hearing this, she didn't get angry. Instead, she teased. If I had known earlier, I would have gone to find Princess Consort and shamelessly claimed her as my sister. Perhaps Prince Yi would have been able to call me that now. Su Fengyan said helplessly, Fortunately, you did not claim my mother as your sister 20 years ago. The sword maniac Helian, the sword monk Chui Meigong, and the oldest swordsman of the Wu family's sword tomb all smiled. After a wave of laughter, Su Fengyan said, You are all famous grandmasters of the sword. If you want to compete with me, then forget it. I will not agree. On this trip, Su Fengyan only had a cold blade at his waist. His fingers rubbed the hilt of the blade at his waist. He raised his head to look at the sky and smiled. When we reach the border, you should see the best blade in the world and see how good it is. In the middle of winter, when it was snowing, the cold blade would be unsheathed and held horizontally. When there was no one around, it would cut the snow. Some people would cut off their heads and drink the blood. Chapter 1249. There are 2 more chapters in the evening. Northwest Frontier Fortress, a lonely city, surrounded by clouds and sand. At dawn, a tall Qi refinement grandmaster pulled the reins and reined in the horse. Looking at the desolate scene of the vast sky and high ground, she felt particularly peaceful. She only had 2 horsemen at her side. Wu Luding and the female sword attendant had parted ways with the Wu clan cavalry a day ago. Under the escort of the white horse Yitzong, they had headed together to the base of the northern Liang Protectorate that was overseen by Mount Chu. If everything went as expected, this group of top-class swordsmen would serve as the sharpest and most secretive blade tip of the northern Liang border army. As for the young minister, Su Beiji, he had already turned back on his horse. She, Su Fengyan, and Sui Xiegu continued north. They directly passed through the border defense line of Liangmang and swaggered into the Southern Dynasty's Dragon Waste state. Tantai Pingjing bent down and stroked the soft mane of the horse. This horse was extraordinarily handsome. Indeed, only Beiliang could raise such an outstanding horse. She looked up at the quiet young Prince Liang sitting high on the horse. Along the way, intelligence reports were constantly sent to him. Su Fengyan read them and burned them casually. It seemed that he had not once interfered with the border military affairs. This kind of hands-off boss seemed very relaxed and comfortable. It was as if he could do the job well for anyone who sat in his position. However, Tantai Pingjing was not a frog at the bottom of the well. Since Beiliang claimed to have 300,000 cavalry, if they were in a peaceful world, not a person with the surname Su could be the Prince of Peace. The Zhao family of Liang would have already cooked the hound. Not to mention, in the current chaotic world, Beimang's million-strong army was pressing on the border. If any mediocre lord who could not convince the masses had the Northwest Gate, before the Beimang army showed their strength, the Beiliang side would have been in chaos. No matter how many border troops there were, as long as the army's morale was slack, even if they gave Beiliang 300,000 soldiers, they would still not be able to stop the fierce army of Beimang that was released from the cage by the old woman. Su Fengyan's thumb and forefinger subconsciously rubbed the rough reins. He stopped the horse on the slope and looked into the distance. The fire and smoke sank to the west. The valley was quiet and the mountains were empty. But the general could fight 100 battles without the emperor building the Great Wall. This was a frontier fortress poem that was popular in the Central Plains. The poet was a poor scholar with a bright future, but trouble came from his mouth. Because of this poem, the poet was suspected to be cold and charming in the literary world. After the poet returned to the Central Plains to be an official, he wasted more than 10 years in the local officialdom and never got promoted. In the end, he was depressed and resigned. When Su Fengyan first traveled in Jianghu with Huang, he once went to the poet's hometown. Although he was very embarrassed at that time, it was not a problem for him to pretend to be rich and buy a pot of wine to visit. Unfortunately, He only saw the moss and did not see the poet. Su Fengyan gently exhaled a turbid breath. At that time, he only thought that the emperor of the Zhao family must have done something. Later, when he personally experienced some of the officialdom rules, he gradually understood that it was not the man sitting on the throne who was so narrow-minded. It was the local officials who were trying to figure out the emperor's mind. Not to mention the distance, just the nearby Beiliang, how many officials, in order to curry favor with him, often used expensive antiques, calligraphy, and paintings to establish a relationship with the Beiliang's Lu family in Qingzhou. How many unknown back doors did they open for the Lu family's children in Beiliang's officialdom to be unimpeded? Even some of the best teachers in Beiliang's academies favored the Lu family's children who had mediocre literary talent and hoped to establish a relationship with the Lu family and then the Su family. If it were not for Lu Qingyan's opinion, Lu Feiqi, the head of the Lu family, would have used this opportunity to become the leader of Beiliang's literary world. Su Fengyan could not help but feel a little sad. He still remembered the ordinary bamboo lantern that the ancestor of the Lu family gave to Lu Feiqi before he died. He wanted Lu Feiqi to take over the lantern that swayed with the chaotic times and strive to pass it on. Obviously, Lu Feiqi, who had long complained about the family moving to the Baron Beiliang, suddenly found that the Lu family had a great reputation in Beiliang after the process of taking root in Beiliang was too smooth. Not only Lu Feiqi, but the entire Lu family was too complacent and was far less conceited than the old fox Wang Linquan, who was a relative of the emperor. But what really made Su Fengyan depressed was Wang Linquan's obedience. The more the Wang family of the Spring God Lake deliberately tolerated the scholarly Lu family, wasn't it deliberately digging a hole for the Lu family to jump into? Compared to the Lu family's insensibility, Wang Linquan's overt schemes were actually more of a headache for Su Fengyan. But these were difficult to resolve and could not be explained clearly. As the son-in-law of the two families, Su Fengyan could not use his status as the king of Beiliang to bully others. The more he did, the more mistakes he would make. In the end, he could not escape the saying that he favored one and discriminated against the other. Fortunately, these thorny matters were not urgent. Moreover, Lu Qingyan handled things appropriately. Even his second sister, Su Weisheng, admitted that she could not find any flaws in Lu Qingyan. Between women, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, sister-in-law and sister-in-law, these relationships were all like swords and knives that did not see blood. Men were naturally incomparably miserable when they were involved. Su Fengyan, or in other words, Beiliang, was facing a great disaster. Ever since Su Shao was conferred the title of king and took over Beiliang, Beimang had been eyeing them covetously. As long as they could destroy Beiliang and bypass the eastern border where Gu Jiantang was overseeing, then the fertile central plains would be like a woman waiting to be slaughtered. How could Beimang, a man who could not endure the hunger and thirst, not risk his life to attack Beiliang? In the past, under the planning of Su Shao and his master Li Yishan, although Beiliang did not have the problem of whether to defend or not, there was still enough space for the Beiliang cavalry to move around. They could take the refugees and retreat to the western regions. They could also retreat to western Shu and Nanzhao as support, enough to fight Beimang to the death. Even if Beimang took over Beiliang, which retreated after the battle went badly, it would be an isolated place with scorched earth. On the contrary, it would increase the supply line of the Beimang army. Beiliang could continue to confront Beimang at the western Shu border and could even harass Beimang in the vast western regions. However, because Chun Jibao was conferred the title of king and entered Beiliang, he cut off the entire western regions of western Shu and Nanzhao. As a result, Su Fengyan and Beiliang had no strategic depth and could only defend to the death. Su Fengyan felt an indescribable sense of guilt deep in his heart. It could not be said that he had let down the Beiliang people, but he felt that he had let down Li Yishan. Chapter 1250. The Northern Liang army was overly optimistic about the Northern Mang royal court's internal affairs. Su Fengyan did not think that this would be able to restrain the military strength of the Northern Mang royal court. With the word advantage in front of them, this was the general trend. As long as the old woman used both kindness and power, she would be suppressed by Tuoba Bodhisattva's great army on one hand, and she would be conferred the title of Marquis on the other hand. She would be able to conquer the Central Plains. It would not take too long for her to truly unite the country and march southward. Sui Siegu was 100 years old and had traveled to the ends of the earth. He had seen all the emperors, generals, and commoners. The affairs of the world could not stir this one-armed old man's emotions. He stood beside Su Fengyan, who was in a daze and felt a little bored. He casually asked, "When this old man was young, he did not understand why the generals and soldiers loved to fight. Were they really not afraid of death? The Spring and Autumn War was easy to understand. People in troubled times were not as good as dogs in times of peace. Life was worthless because they were forced to not take it seriously. Now that Beiliang has been at peace for a long time, can it really stop the million-strong Beimang army?" Su Fengyan calmly said, "It's simple. Give up one's home for the country and give up one's life for one's home. No one is not afraid of death. It's just that everyone knows that the Beiliang cavalry is not afraid of death. Other than the fact that the Beiliang people are naturally brave, many of them also know that they have no way out. Their home is in Beiliang. If they retreat, the border troops will disperse and the Beimang army will invade the south. Even if they escape from Beiliang, their 2 legs will not be able to outrun the 4 legs of the Beimang army." Sui Siegu curled his lips and mocked, "None of you officials are good people." Su Fengyan laughed, "Don't I have no way out too?" Sui Siegu rolled his eyes and said, "With your skills, if you really want to kill people, why don't you go to Dragon Waste State alone and kill them all? Don't tell me that Bodhisattva Tuoba, Hong Jingyan, and the others are following behind you every day." Su Fengyan said indifferently, "I can kill like this, but so can the people on the Beimang martial arts ranking. When 2 countries are at war, this kind of action can't be said to be meaningless, but it really doesn't have much meaning. Of course, if one day Beiliang can no longer defend the Northwest Gate, I will definitely do so." Sui Siegu was about to speak when he heard Tantai Pingjing snort coldly. The sword-eater old monster immediately shut his mouth. At this moment, there was a cloud of dust in the distance. Looking at the route, it seemed that they were going south. They probably saw the 3 horses on the small sand slope. These people with superb riding skills headed straight for the slope. However, they did not act blindly without thinking. Instead, they stopped 500 feet away from the bottom of the slope and looked at Su Fengyan and the other 2 on the slope. This was a Northern Mang elite scout. Judging from his armor and clothing, he wasn't the Crow Palanzi, who was equally famous as Northern Liang's wandering crossbowman. He should be the vanguard under Southern Dynasty's great General Lu Gui's direct command. Lu Gui was once praised by the Beimang Empress as being half a Su Shao. He was originally one of the candidates to replace Huang Songpu as the king of the Southern Courtyard. However, the fatty dong that the old woman mentioned beat him to it. As a scout, regardless of whether it was from the Northern Mang or the Northern Liang, they were all very particular about the rules. Unless they encountered each other on a narrow path, collecting military intelligence under the premise that their whereabouts were not exposed was their first priority. However, if they could casually take the enemy's head, no one would refuse. A rider rushed out of the group of scouts and shot an arrow from 100 paces away. His aim was excellent. The arrow flew straight towards Su Fengyan's head, who was in the middle of the 3 riders on the slope. This barbarian probably wanted to confirm the strength of these 3 riders. If they were not to be trifled with, then he would retreat. If they were just embroidered pillows, then he would kill them and take their horses. Now that the 2 armies of Liang Mang were facing off, the scouts would be the first to exchange lives. Su Fengyan turned his head and dodged the arrow. The scout quickly turned his horse around and retreated. Sui Siegu stared with wide eyes and asked, "You don't want to eat meat that's delivered to your mouth? Isn't mosquito meat?" Su Fengyan shook his head and said, "Naturally, there will be top-notch Beiliang crossbowmen secretly watching us. Right now, Beimang's harassment seems very inexplicable. In order to obtain Beimang's precise motive, I have already paid an immeasurable price. The route of these Beimang scouts is the most valuable clue. As for who is the real bait, it will depend on the strength and luck of both sides." Sui Siegu said in a carefree manner, "Bent intestines, how unpleasant." Su Fengyan laughed and said, "Do you want Beimang's million-strong army to obediently gather in one place and then fight with 30 of us in one go?" Sui Siegu asked back, You save the trouble and he saves the trouble. Everyone will be happy. Whoever loses will scram. What else do you want? Su Fengyan couldn't help but laugh. The northern barbarians really want Beiliang to do that. To be honest, I also want to do that. The old swordsman's words sounded very absurd and amateurish. But if Liang Mang could really be so decisive and leave no room for negotiation, then everyone would be happy. Northern Mang would have the hope of taking down the tiger blocking their way south, and Northern Liang would also have the hope of defeating the Northern Mang army in one fell swoop. Beimang's advantage was very obvious. They had an absolute advantage in terms of numbers, but Beiliang's advantage was that Beimang's army was temporarily leaderless. Although Dong Zhuo was the commander in name, other than the 100,000-strong Dong family army, Hong Jingyan's Ruran cavalry, Dragon Waste Province's Gusai Province's Fifth Army, and Lu Gui and Yang Yuanzhan's personal armies, he, as the king of the south, could not command them as he wished. On the other hand, Beiliang was different. Chu Lushan and Yuan Zuozong could control Beiliang's army. In a confrontation where victory would be decided in one battle, this was where Beiliang's opportunity lay. However, this kind of battle of wills that was equivalent to betting the throne of two dynasties was too extravagant for both sides. Su Fengyan looked at the Beimang scouts retreating north and said softly, "Half of Su Shao? No matter who wins or loses this battle, Lu Gui's 40,000 men will all die." Tantai Pingjing asked, "What do you say next? Go to the Governor-General house or continue north? Let's go take a look at Beimang's million-strong army." Su Fengyan urged his horse down the slope and galloped north. Sui Shegu, who was following behind, said angrily, "Didn't you just say that such actions are meaningless?" Su Fengyan smiled and turned to look at the tall woman. He acted dumb and asked, "Senior Tantai, did I say that?" Tantai Pingjing said expressionlessly, "No." Sui Shegu wanted to say something but stopped. He felt really uncomfortable. Su Fengyan started to hum a tune. "The king told me to patrol the mountain. After patrolling the north mountain, I will patrol the south." He patrolled the east mountain to kill the passers-by, and patrolled the west mountain to watch the sun. "My king has 3 heads and 6 arms. Oh, I snatched Lil Miss and carried her on my back. I'm so pitiful that I can't swallow the fat meat in my mouth. When will I be able to become a king?" Chapter 1251. The third chapter was uploaded in the wee hours of the morning and will not be included in tomorrow's update. 2 chapters tomorrow. The Liang dynasty had 2 anomalies. One was Su Shao. Even though he had become a king with a different surname, the soldiers under him still liked to call him Great General. Another one was Gu Jiantang. Although he had not been conferred the title of king or vassal, he had been the minister of war for more than 10 years. Most of the generals had addressed him as Great General in private. Now, he had become the only person in Liang who had a rank of first-class merit. At the border of Liao and Liao, he was still known as Great General. After the Spring and Autumn War came to an end, Gu Jiantang, whose military achievements were slightly inferior to Su Zhao's, was undoubtedly more favored by the nobles of Liang's old faction and the new nobles of the dynasty. After Su Zhao's death, the well-deserving leader of Liang's army left the capital and took charge of the entire military and politics of the northern lands. Whether it was the authority in Gu Jiantang's hands or his reputation in Liang's court, both rose sharply. Even the dullest officials in the capital knew that General Gu Jiantang, who was far from being called an old official, would become a pillar of support for 3 dynasties. It was only a matter of time. Don't forget that Gu Jiantang was also an expert who had entered the martial arts rankings. With his strong body and great energy, it would be too easy for him to last another 20 to 30 years. Therefore, the saying that border generals were envied did not apply to Gu Jiantang. After Gu Jiantang took over the Liao, the eastern front of the Liang dynasty, which had eaten up countless soldiers' salaries and silver, was said to be impregnable. Everyone in the Liao border army followed Gu Jiantang's lead. Especially before Great General Gu resigned as the Minister of War, Great Peace City had some objections to the bottomless Liao soldiers' salaries. After Gu Jiantang left the capital and went to the north, although Gu Lu, which had lost its backbone, started to fall apart, the court's support for the eastern Liao border army became greater and greater. Originally, the court would be hesitant about the rewards for the soldiers at the border, dragging it out and reducing it if they could. Now it was unobstructed and not reduced. With such a general, the Liao border army had a new look and a rare morale. There were even rumors circulating in private that great General Gu might be able to go one step further. Since Su Xiao was a great general, Su Xiao had been a pillar of the country, and he was also one. Then, since Su Xiao was a king with a different surname, why couldn't he, Gu Jiantang, be one? Who in the world didn't know that the court was wary of Beiliang, but trusted great General Gu? The morale of the Eastern Front was high, especially after the northern barbarians brazenly split up their troops. Almost all the generals of the two Liao had gone to the general's tent to ask for battle. Since the northern barbarians clearly bullied the weak and feared the strong and decided to attack Beiliang first, why did they dare to challenge us with only 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers? Were they enough to fill the gaps between the teeth of our Eastern Front army? But whether it was the old subordinates who had followed Gu Jiantang during the Spring and Autumn War or the outsiders of Gu Lu who had been steadily rising in the Tu Liao, none of them were able to make the general nod. In the end, many generals were even chased out of the tent by the general, who didn't get tired of them. It was about to be winter. The Tu Liao were bitterly cold, and the coldness was bone-chilling. On the official road leading to a Wu castle, the leader of the cavalry was a man wearing a slightly old and expensive fox fur coat. Under the fox fur coat was an iron armor that was still as bright as new after many years. Behind him were 200 elite light cavalrymen who were familiar with archery and horses. The man was no longer young. His hair was white, but at a glance, there was no trace of fatigue or lethargy on his body. One could even clearly recognize his iron-blooded temperament that was full of hard edges. It was hard to imagine that a man who was almost 50 years old and had been an official of the capital for more than 10 years still hadn't lost any of his sharpness in the officialdom. On the contrary, those 10 years of hibernation were like 10 years of sharpening a knife. The more you sharpened it, the sharper it became. It must be known that the old fur coat he was wearing had extraordinary significance. Back when the Zhao family ruled the world, the late emperor of Liang rewarded them according to their merits. Countless civil and military officials were promoted and rewarded with wealth and mansions. However, only 3 people were bestowed with fox fur coats by the late emperor. At that time, the only civil official who received this honor was the youngest grand secretary in the history of Liang, the blue-eyed Zhang Julu. The only generals who had helped the Zhao family conquer the world with a blade and a spear were Su Xiao and him. After he gave the talisman knife Nanhua to that interesting young man, he only had the most ordinary frontier army battle knife as a pendant. However, no one dared to deny that he was the #1 expert in blade techniques in the world. Unlike the top swordsmen of Jianghu who each had their own style, the people who used the blade in the world, even those who were crowned with the title of Grandmaster, seemed to be miles apart from this person. No wonder Wu Ping said that he alone occupied half of the world's blade intent. A group of travel-worn riders entered the official road from a small path in the west. Behind the man were 2 young military officers with similar appearances. One of them frowned slightly, while the other, younger, smiled knowingly. In the entire Liao, only that girl and that madman dared to block the road like this. Couldn't be helped. One of them was their father's most beloved daughter, while the other was half a son and half a son-in-law. These 2 military officers with real power at the border were not the sons of the aristocratic families in the capital who came to Liao to gild their names. They were able to obtain their positions and military power today because of the military merits they gained from climbing through piles of corpses on the battlefield. Gu Donghai and Gu Shishan were sons of the most influential families in the Liang dynasty. However, these 2 young men had started out as ordinary soldiers. After they were promoted to military officers, even their superiors didn't know their true identities. It wasn't until they became military officers in charge of military affairs that they were able to enter the sights of the high-ranking generals of the Tu Liao. At that time, they were still the sons of the Minister of War. Only then were they recognized by the generals who were familiar with the capital's officialdom. The man and woman of the cavalry naturally rode side by side with Gu Donghai and Gu Shishan, without any sense of unfamiliarity. Gu Shishan rudely said to that guy, "Madman Yuan, You came empty-handed? You're not paying attention, kid. Aren't you afraid that your future brother-in-law won't pay attention to you? The young swordsman called Madman Yuan grinned, revealing a mouthful of cold, snow-white teeth. He gestured with his chin at the woman beside him. What's there to pay attention to? This time, your sister almost burned down Wild Goose Castle in Jizhou. Gu Shishan, your family sells vinegar, right? You're such a big vinegar jar. With her ruckus, the entire Liao can smell the vinegar. The woman smiled but didn't say anything. Gu Shishan laughed and said, You should be content. If it was anyone else who dared to do this, wouldn't the man's thing be castrated to go with wine? Not to mention the women of Wild Goose Castle, even if it was a princess or a princess, she would go up and slap them. This time, she was just giving people a hard time. You should be burning incense to thank the gods. Chapter 12:52. The young man with the saber at his waist was the #1 saber in the world, Southflower Saber. He wanted to speak, but when he saw the back of the tall man, he gave up. No matter how heartless and courageous he was, he did not dare to speak ill of his future wife in front of his father-in-law. Gu Shishan stared and asked, Yuan Tingshan, did you really come empty-handed? The young man who now had more than half of the power in Jibei smiled and said, I just chopped off more than 600 heads of northern barbarians. You want them? I'll send someone to deliver them to you later. Gu Shishan was slightly envious and asked in a low voice, Yuan Tingshan, why don't I go with you to Ji province? We haven't had a war for many years. Your business seems to be booming. I can even be a military officer for you. Yuan Tingshan, who was popular in both Liao and Ji province, said disdainfully, Military officer? Don't even think about it. Do you want to be a cart driver or not? Gu Shishan cursed. Gu Donghai dismissed it with a smile. He had always been amiable to Yuan Tingshan, his brother-in-law. He had never put on airs as a descendant of a famous general, nor had he shown any contempt for the lowly Jianghu people in the eyes of the top nobles. On the contrary, this time Wild Goose Castle had recognized Yuan Tingshan as their son-in-law. Otherwise, no matter how powerful Wild Goose Castle was in Ji province, they would not dare to fight with the Gu family. Although their father had never verbally acknowledged Yuan Tingshan as his adopted son or son-in-law, he had brought Yuan Tingshan to the capital twice. This was enough to explain everything to the capital and Liao. Gu Jiantang suddenly called out to Yuan Tingshan. The latter quickly patted his horse and followed. The three siblings consciously slowed down their horses. Gu Jiantang said calmly, You sent a report to Great Peace City. Yuan Tingshan pursed his lips and did not explain anything. Gu Jiantang's tone was still emotionless. After Donghu marries you, she will no longer be part of the Gu family. Yuan Tingshan felt as if he was struck by lightning, but he still did not want to lower his head. He said in a low voice, General, don't worry. I can raise her. The corners of Gu Jiantang's mouth seemed to curve into a sneer. Yuan Tingshan pulled on the reins and abruptly stopped the horse. Other than Gu Jiantang, Gu Beihu, who had made up her mind to follow her husband, Gu Donghai and Gu Shishan, who were confused, continued to follow Gu Jiantang to Fort Wu. She asked carefully, What's wrong? Did you make my father unhappy? Yuan Tingshan grimaced, looking like he had a headache. The horseman he brought with him also stopped by the side of the road. Yuan Tingshan rubbed his chin and said, Your father is really interesting. He obviously wants to eat the 200,000 Beimang soldiers, but he wants to be a stone Buddha. Even after I handed over the booklet, it would only benefit your father, but your father still refused. I just can't figure it out. What's the point of being a pillar of the country? Gu Beihu was shocked. Wasn't that memorial to ask for merit from the Ministry of War? Yuan Tingshan tilted his head and spat. A few hundred barbarians' heads are nothing to me. I'll feel ashamed if I tell others about it. If I want to do something, I'll do something big. This time, I'm helping the Zhao Emperor kill a man. His head is worth a few 100,000 barbarians. Gu Beihu was stunned. Gu Jiantang turned his head and looked towards the south. His eyes were dark and complicated. In the imperial study of Great Peace City, the Emperor of Zhao walked to the center of the study, squatted down and used a pair of tongs to stir the charcoal in the brazier. Beside him, Song Tonglu, the head of ceremony directorate who served the emperor, bent his back and trotted over. His steps were quiet, like the steps of an agile cat, but one could see that this successor of Han Shengxian was trembling with fear. There was a memorial in the hand of the emperor of Zhao clan, and Song Tonglu knew it very well. It was sent to him by Yuan Tingshan, a popular figure in Jibei. As for what was written on the memorial when Han Shengxian was still the head eunuch, he could read it first before deciding whether to submit it to the emperor or to the Ministry of War. But now, the imperial palace had set up an assistant eunuch, and Song Tonglu did not dare to touch it anymore. The emperor of Zhao family held the memorial and placed it on the burning charcoal. But when he lit a corner, he hesitated and pulled his hand back. He knocked on the edge of the brazier and extinguished the flame. There were 4 or 5 life attendants in the imperial study. They were all quite young, and they were still buried in their books. They did not seem to have noticed the strange scene. The charcoal fire shone on the pale face of the emperor of Zhao family. A great eunuch who was allowed to wear a bright red robe said softly outside the room, "Your Majesty, the Right Chancellor of the Imperial College, Jean Lanting, requests an audience." The emperor of Zhao family's arms hung in the air. He was deep in thought, as if he did not hear the voice that was neither soft nor loud. Song Tonglu held his breath and bent down. He did not dare to speak, but he stretched one hand behind his back and waved at the open door. The great eunuch, who was also bent down, should not be able to see the subtle movement of the ceremony supervisor's palm seal, but he immediately moved back. The emperor of Zhao family slowly came back to his senses and said calmly, "Permission granted." Song Tonglu said softly, "Your Majesty." The emperor of Zhao family grunted in acknowledgement. Soon, Song Tonglu quietly brought in a small embroidered stool. The emperor of Zhao family sat in front of the brazier. The memorial was placed on the front lapel of his yellow dragon robe. It was placed on a beautiful dragon that was baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. Jean Lanting, who had a beautiful beard, stepped over the threshold and was about to kneel down when the emperor of Zhao family said softly, "You're excused." The emperor of Zhao family stretched out his hand. Song Tonglu hurriedly brought in another stool. Jean Lanting, who was flattered, carefully sat down after thanking him. The emperor of Zhao family looked at the scholar from Beiliang. The haze between his eyebrows seemed to have lightened a bit. He said pleasantly, "Third young master, do you have something to report?" Jean Lanting's expression was calm and resolute. It was as if he was possessed by a god. He looked like he was about to die. He said respectfully, "I do have something to report. I should have reported it to you, but I think I should still report it to your Majesty face to face." Jean Lanting stood up, bent down and took a few steps back. He knelt down with all his strength and prostrated himself on the ground. He said slowly, "Your humble servant Jean Lanting wants to impeach Grand Secretary Zhang Julu for 10 major crimes. Your humble servant." Grand Secretary. In the imperial study, almost all of the emperor's personal servants trembled. The emperor of Zhao family was silent. In the eastern palace, Crown Prince Zhao Zhuan stood alone under the golden birdcage with a dumb parrot. He was whistling happily. He said to himself, "His purpose is to be the world's #1 traitor since ancient times. He used power to avoid it. Let me calculate how many crimes are there. Controlling the power of the court and acting arbitrarily. Raising a border army for private reasons and squandering the national treasury. Colluding with the powerful eunuch Han Shengxian. Framing the valiant martyr Han family for personal reasons. Not doing enough to govern the country, leading to the restoration of West Chu. And I can't seem to think of anything else even after racking my brains." Speaking of this, the crown prince smiled. "It's really been hard on our third young master Jean." Chapter 1253. As Beimang's army moved southward, Lioa City, which was located at the border of Dragon Waste State, became an extremely eye-catching town. After the previous city magistrate, Tao Qianji, died without reason, the new city magistrate who replaced him naturally rose in status in the imperial court. However, when he received the news in haste, he was still quite frightened. Leading a few of his personal guards, he rushed out of the city with all his might. However, at the intersection of an official road and a small winding path, he was rudely stopped. The city overseer did not complain at all, only resentfully returning to his residence. On the way back, he didn't need to rush. From time to time, he would turn his head to size up the few solemn cavalrymen. Hey, it's Baimang's self-proclaimed second-best scout, Crow Palanzi. It's said that training a single Crow Palanzi is comparable to training 2 heavy cavalrymen in Biting's imperial tent. Only that fatty was willing to spend so much money. Ever since Dong Zhuo was promoted, he still wore armor when he went out. Even when he went to the imperial court to see Her Majesty, he didn't wear the prominent official robe of the king of the southern courtyard. However, this time he didn't alert any of the border armies. When he arrived near Liyue City, he changed into this robe that could be said to be second only to one person. He held the small hand of Tao Qianji's daughter, Tao Manwu, and walked to the front of the old and new graves. The old grave was quite old. Although the one lying in it had no relatives or friends, it wasn't overgrown with weeds in the past. This was because when the one lying in the new grave was alive, he would often have people pull out weeds. After he retired from the position of commandant of Chong and became the city magistrate of Liyue City, he would often visit the grave. Unfortunately, now that he was neighbors with the old guy, he was powerless even if he wanted to. Dong Zhuo was squatted behind him and put a pot of wine at his feet. He first quietly pulled out the yellowed weeds on the old grave and murmured, "Old Corporal, don't blame little fatty Dong. I once swore that as long as I didn't become a rank 1 high official, I wouldn't have the face to visit your grave and toast you. Today, this little fatty can be considered to have struck it rich. Your face is so bright. Why don't you grin? What? Do you finally realize that your mouth full of yellow teeth looks terrifying?" Dong Zhuo, who had outstanding military exploits, whether it was chasing or fleeing on the battlefield, even without a warhorse, his 2 legs were faster than 4 legs. However, at this time, it was particularly difficult to pull out the weeds that could be easily understood by young children. The great general and the king of the southern courtyard liked to call the empress sister, and even liked to paste spring festival couplets on people's doors. At this moment, his face was covered in tears. He then wiped his face, his tears and snot, tears and wiped. His face, tears and his nose was unclear. Corporal, there's a sayings is, tears and his nose, his tears, and his tears and his tears and his ants. S to what I wear? The is King's Row. S was SS. Old Sergeant, can you believe it? Back then, that little fatty whose legs would go soft whenever he saw a small-scale Northern Liang cavalry, and that little fatty whom you scolded as a coward, was the most senior official among all the soldiers you brought. Dong Zhuo didn't turn his head. He just pointed at the new grave and said, "Look at that bastard Tao Qianji. He's worse than you. He didn't even die on the battlefield. He died just like that. If he's not AF** king deserter, then what is he? Corporal, can you sleep soundly with this kind of person as your neighbor? In any case, I, Dong Zhuo, won't believe it even if I'm beaten to death." Dong Zhuo suddenly turned his head and roared at the new grave, "Tao Qianji, I'm scolding you. After the old corporal left, you were the first among your brothers to become a corporal, the first to become a commandant, and the first to become a general. You think these are amazing? **T. The highest ranking official in your life is the commandant general, the lousy city overseer who left behind a small city. Damn you." Dong Zhuo smiled bitterly. "I know. You think it's shameful to be with me. That's why you're unwilling to come to the Dong army to help me. Others are just suffering because they want to save face. Look at you. You're dead. Aren't you? If you have the ability to crawl out, I'll kick you back." Dong Zhuo was probably afraid that he would frighten the little girl kneeling in front of the new grave, so he restrained himself. He unscrewed the lid of the wine pot and took out 3 wine cups from his bosom. He put one on the grave of the old corporal, squeezed out a smile and said to Tao Manwu, "Little Manwu, give the cup to your father. With his alcohol addiction, he must be craving for wine after lying down for so long." The little girl took the cup with both hands. Uncle Dong poured her a cup of wine and gently sprinkled it in front of her father's grave. Dongzhuo sprinkled a cup of wine in front of the old grave. He also raised his head and drank a cup. After pouring another cup for himself, he drank it in one gulp. Seeing little Manwu holding the cup with both hands, Dongzhuo smiled and said, "I won't let your father drink. I'll just let him lie there and stare." The little girl's eyes were filled with tears, but she tried hard not to cry out loud. She felt wronged and sad. Dongzhuo hurriedly poured a cup of wine for her. Seeing the child seriously sprinkle another cup of wine, Dongzhuo's eyes became sour again. He tilted his head to look at the new grave and said in a low voice, "Don't worry, little Manwu is more of a daughter than my own daughter. As long as I conquer Bailiang, if I'm still alive, I won't dare to say that I'll give the entire Central Plains to little Manwu as a dowry, but half of it won't be able to escape." Dongzhuo turned to look at the old grave and said, "Old Corporal, are you going to say that I, little fatty Dong, am bragging again? This time you really shouldn't look down on me. Nowadays, if I fart in the imperial court, a lot of people will say that it smells good." Hong Jingyan, Murong Baoding, and the rest of those awe-inspiring bastards all had to obediently assist me. Isn't the Bailiang cavalry the best in the world? Old Corporal, you have the guts to say that you want tens of thousands of them to die this winter? If even one of them dies, I'll dig a hole next to you and bury myself. I'll be your neighbor. If you really can't say it, you can just tell me in my dreams. Tao Manwu asked for another cup of wine from Uncle Dong. After sprinkling the third cup of wine, he put down the cup and knelt in front of the grave without saying a word. Chapter 1254. Dongzhuo did not let her get up, nor did he console her. He sat down on the ground and poured the remaining wine into the mud. He said softly, "Back then you only brought a few soldiers with you. I, Dongzhuo, have 100,000 soldiers under my command. I also have the best crowbars in Beimang and the best foot soldiers in Beimang. The 300,000 soldiers in the 20 or so military towns in the southernmost prefectures of Gusai and Longyao are under my command. Hong Jingyan's Ruring cavalry and the 100,000 private soldiers of great generals like Lu Gui and Yang Yuanzan are still under my command. Further north, the two Jidushi who are holding half of the military tally, 200,000 soldiers, have also obediently handed it over to me. Once His Majesty has cleaned up the grasslands in the north, other than Tuoba, everyone else who has reached the border of the southern dynasties will also be under my command. Bailiang is not that big. With so many people and so many war horses, just a little pea is enough to cause a flood in Bailiang. A big battle before spring, and at most a battle during the autumn hunt next year. Bailiang will be completely finished." Dongzhuo laughed sinisterly. "Bailiang must think that the battle will last for 3 to 5 years. I, Dongzhuo, have been a fox for more than 10 years. This time, I will be the alpha wolf. I will not rest until I have eaten my fill." Dongzhuo grabbed a handful of mud and threw it away. He stood up and said, "Old Dekarch, old Tao, I will take this empty wine pot with me. When I lead the army to the southern border of Liang, I will bring back a pot of mud from there. I will let you two country bumpkins who have never even been to Bailiang see what kind of fertile soil can grow rice." Dongzhuo stood up and looked at young man Wu who was still kneeling. He bent down and rubbed her little head. He said softly, "We should go." The little girl stood up and silently raised her arm to wipe away her tears. Dongzhuo thought for a moment and lowered his head to look at the luxurious robe he was wearing. He took it off, folded it neatly, and placed it between the two graves. He said indifferently, "Returning home in glory, no one will look at me. Then why are you still wearing it?" Dongzhuo placed young man Wu on his shoulder and left in large strides. He smiled and said, "Young man Wu, didn't uncle give you a pony? Very soon you will be able to cross the river with our 1,000,000-strong army." Iron horses and ice rivers entered the Central Plains. When the news spread throughout the capital, Great Peace City was not in an uproar. Everyone was silent out of fear. It was not easy to live in the capital. However, the Right Chancellor of the Imperial College, Jean Lanting, who had risen to the top in just a few years, listed out the 10 major crimes and impeached none other than the founder of the Liang dynasty, Grand Secretary Zhang Julu. Most of the people in the capital felt that this outsider had truly gone mad. Challenging Grand Secretary Zhang. If this wasn't throwing an egg against a rock, what was it? During these dozen or so years, the people who wanted the Grand Secretary to lose his position could be said to have come one after another. Every now and then, they would jump around a few times. However, most of the time, the Grand Secretary didn't even bother to give them a proper look. Meanwhile, these people who overestimated their own abilities were all-important figures who could shake the capital with a stomp of their feet, all of them deeply rooted. However, who succeeded? Moreover, their appetites weren't that great. They only wanted that green-eyed child to take off his official robe, not daring to have this number one civil official of Liang Imperial Court meet the late emperor. Of the 10 great crimes, the one that everyone believed in the most was actually the one that forced the death of Ji Province's Han family. This was indeed a secret matter passed down by the father-son-in-law Grand Secretaries. Jean Lanting used the 8 words "lantern light continues, endless salary" to describe Zhang Julu's political reform. It could be said to be incomparably accurate. Meanwhile, what was worth pondering over was the crime of colluding with the powerful official Han Shengxian, leading to a foul atmosphere in the inner and outer courts. Now that the human cat Han Shengxian was already dead, how was the Grand Secretary going to defend himself? However, the one that carried the most destructive force was also the one that left everyone feeling the most inconceivable. It wasn't privately raising the 2 vast border armies, but rather the last of the 10 great crimes. After ruling for more than 10 years, he opened up a large amount of salt and iron, pouring all of his energy into the northwest. When this news quickly settled down, it seemed like it quickly disappeared without a trace. But more and more people began to chew on the hidden meaning within. Even though the Grand Secretary still participated in the court assembly every day, when he needed to stay overnight, he would definitely be on duty in the Minister province, handling all types of government affairs still in an orderly manner. However, it wasn't strange for the Grand Secretary's residence to be completely deserted. After all, the Grand Secretary had never liked to privately meet with guests. However, the great residences on the same street as the Grand Secretary also began to be deserted, making the onlookers' imaginations run wild. More importantly, this time Zhang Julu didn't strike like he did against Zhao Shixuangue. Bai Yan didn't react at all to the ungrateful and mad dog biting of 3rd Jean, the Right Chancellor of the Imperial College. At the same time, there was one matter that had to be mentioned. That was Yin Maochun, who had the title of Hidden Minister and was in charge of the evaluation of local officials this year, had quietly returned to the capital ahead of time. The Emperor and the Crown Prince paid a visit to Qi Yanglong's mansion. Huan Wen claimed that he was sick and didn't participate in the court assembly. Immediately after, the sound of winter thunder rang out in Great Peace City. General Yang Xinqing, who had been caught by the West Chu rebel army and was covered in dirt, secretly went to Great Peace City to prove that the Grand Secretary Zhang Julu had framed the Han family in the past and wasn't wrong. On the day of the beginning of winter, the Emperor personally led a group of Great Peace City officials to welcome the winter in the northern suburbs. Among the nobles, other than Huan Wen, who still didn't appear, all the officials in the capital led by Zhang Julu were present. Thus, there was no morning court assembly for the beginning of winter. However, after the beginning of winter, there would be a grand court assembly. The Son of Heaven would bestow jackets to the officials, implying that he sympathized with the officials to protect them from the winter cold. On this day, Tantanon, who had gotten up early before the sun rose, sat alone in the study and stared blankly at the sky outside the window for a long time. The sky gradually brightened. The old man went to the bookshelf and took out a handwritten book that his teacher had given him. He ground the ink himself and shakily wrote a line of words on the title page of the handwritten book. He planned to have the steward of the residence send it to the Grand Secretary's residence. Winter is getting colder. Old friend, please wear more clothes. After writing, the old man started to stare blankly again. Then, an old steward of the residence stumbled into the study with a pale face. He said sorrowfully, as if the sky had fallen, "Master, The Grand Secretary said in the court assembly that the 2 generations of the Su family have guarded the Northwest for more than 20 years and have worked hard. Su Fengyan has inherited his father's work and is loyal. He should be made a pillar of the country. What should we do? Why did the Grand Secretary do this? Most importantly, His Majesty didn't get angry. Although he didn't agree to the pillar of the country, after the imperial edict was rejected, he once again bestowed the new Prince Liang a pillar of the country. Huan Wen waved his hand expressionlessly, indicating for the old steward to leave. The study returned to silence. Huan Wen gently closed the precious handwritten book that had been opened and muttered, "Old man, I can only burn it for you." Chapter 12:55. There's one more chapter in the morning, not included in tomorrow's update. 2 more chapters for tomorrow. In the winter, the water outside the Great Wall dried up and the grass turned yellow. To be able to come across a little bit of tenacious greenery was exceptionally pleasing. The 3 of them stopped their horses by the bank of a water source. If they rode straight north for 3 days, they would be able to see the tiled city. Su Fengyan squatted down, scooped up a handful of water and splashed it on his face. He exhaled deeply. Sui Xiegu, who was not familiar with military affairs, asked casually, "Are these northern barbarians out of their minds? Why don't they station their troops at the border in early autumn? Didn't these nomadic barbarians, who lived on horseback, invade the central plains in autumn to plunder the harvest? What's the point of plundering in winter?" Su Fengyan could not help but laugh. Tan Tai Ping explained calmly, "What you're saying is the general situation. In the past, the nomadic tribes brought great damage to the central plains. Most of them came south in winter, taking advantage of the frozen river to allow the cavalry to pass unimpeded. At the end of the Dafeng dynasty, the northern barbarians used this opportunity to invade the central plains." Su Fengyan continued, "The relationship between the grassland nomads and the central plains farming dynasties is like that of a wolf and a tiger. The latter always has the initiative. Whenever the latter is in a state of exhaustion due to the alternation between prosperity and decline, they are like a young tiger, a sick tiger, or a tiger that is about to die of old age. That's when the northern barbarians are at their strongest. Therefore, every time there is a civil war in the central plains, the northern barbarians will invade the border and take advantage of the situation. But in the end, from the Great Qin to Liang, it was the central plains dynasties that suppressed the northern barbarians. You have to know that the official history of the Great Qin recorded that 5 barbarians were equal to 1 Qin soldier. The official history of the Dafeng dynasty also said that the barbarians were skilled in Qin, but 3 of them were equal to 1 Dafeng soldier. That is to say, even if the northern nomads had obtained many forging techniques from the Great Qin dynasty, 3 of them were only equal to 1 Dafeng soldier. But today, Beimang relies on the southern dynasty that has absorbed countless people from the spring and autumn period. In the central plains, only the elite troops of Zhao Yi, the Prince of Guangling, and Zhao Bing, the Prince of Yanqi, dare to claim to be equal to the Beimang. Sui Xiegu could not help but ask, "Is the Liang dynasty not strong enough to unify the central plains? Didn't they say that Liang was as powerful as the Great Qin?" Su Fengyan laughed and said, "If the current emperor had not been in a hurry to show the world his great talent and strategy when he first ascended to the throne, and had not fought those wars with Beimang, and had instead calmly digested the strength of the 8 kingdoms of spring and autumn, then it would not have mattered at all whether our Beimang had 300,000 soldiers or not. At most, it would have been the icing on the cake." Sui Xiegu glared and said, "Is that Emperor Zhao's brain flooded with water? At that time, there were no strategists to dissuade him?" Su Fengyan said helplessly, "At that time, the odds between Liang and Beimang were 50 to 50. Who would dare to carelessly persuade them? What's more, the Zhao family's son of heaven wanted to rely on his military exploits to suppress a large number of famous generals, led by my father and Gu Jiantang. In this world, how can there be such a clear distinction between right and wrong between people and matters? Take me for example, I am Su Zhao's son. In my eyes, Su Xiao is naturally a king of a different surname who did not commit any major crimes but had countless great achievements. In the eyes of Crown Prince Zhao Zhuan and the other princes, The current emperor must be the most diligent and caring emperor in the history of Liang. Back then, when Zhao Kai wanted to kill me at the Marsh of Reeds, I also wanted to go to Iron Gate Pass to kill him. Between the two of us, neither of us is a person who has committed the most heinous crimes. It's just that there's no other way. At that time, we were both chess pieces, pawns that were pushed across the river. Sui Siegu mocked. Oh, from your tone, it seems like you've turned into a chess player today? Su Fengyan smiled and did not reply to old ancestor Qi Jian's sarcasm. He stood up and looked towards the north. On the line there was the military town of Huazhujun, Shijing, Golden Toad State, and further north was the Beimang royal court. Tantai Pingjing, who was dressed in the white robes of a Qi refinement warrior, suddenly said, "To the nomadic tribes, isn't a strong and stable Central Plains dynasty also a disaster? Once the ruler of this dynasty admires Bian Gong, he will be surrounded by a group of talented generals who hope to spread their whips across the desert. The reverse is also true. Even if the Liang dynasty is destroyed and the monarch with the surname changes one after another, the battle between the nomadic tribes and the farming dynasty will not change." Su Fengyan shook his head and said, "Yes." Tantai Pingjing was in disbelief. "Yes." Su Fengyan stretched out a finger and pointed to the north. "As long as we can conquer this land, we can then build several great Qin roads that run through Beimang." Tantai Pingjing's face was full of disbelief. "Are you crazy?" Su Fengyan narrowed his eyes and said softly, "I am not crazy. If one were to talk about crazy, then that would be the young Grand Secretary who was in charge of the country at that time. Back then, Su Xiao and Gu Jiantang argued endlessly about who to choose to guard the northwest gate. On the surface, both Grand Secretaries resolutely opposed my father being the ruler of a different surname. However, I only learned of an inside story much later. Among the opposition, someone convinced the old Grand Secretary who had retired from his official position and returned to his hometown but still retained his authority. This person was Zhang Julu. Because this civil official who had never joined the army had an ambition that all military generals could not imagine. The young Grand Secretary wanted to use Beiliang as the outpost to attack Beimang, and use the Beiliang cavalry as the main force to attack Beimang. This would reduce the loss of military strength and supply pressure of Liang as much as possible. Under this premise, Grand Secretary Zhang would have the imperial court acquiesce to the Su family's limited infiltration of Shishu and Nanzhao. Chapter 1256. Su Fengyan slowly said, "In a situation where this young Grand Secretary and Beiliang both sides are well aware of, there are many things that cannot be resisted. Among them, the Han family that is filled with martyrs is too stubborn and conservative, also not wishing to use their entire family's foundation as a wedding dress for Beiliang's Su family. Once they compromise, the Han family's status as the northern military's mainstay will disappear. Then the Han family that has fought against the northern nomads for generations will also quickly become a thing of the past. You have to understand that when the Su family died, the Han family's head was still drinking and chatting merrily with my father, these two close friends. If I remember correctly, the first matchmaker I met wasn't that prince consort, but rather a little girl from the Han family who still had goat horns. She was behind her father, half of her face exposed, making a face at me." Su Fengyan's hands withdrew into his sleeves. At first, things didn't fall apart. The Han family also put in a lot of effort. Then Yuan Bunshi stuck his foot in, viciously dealing with Zhang Julu. By the time my father mobilized the armored cavalry, crossed the border to rescue the Han family children, everything was already too late. Su Fengyan looked towards the sky. "When I was young, I would often dream of that goat-horned girl, half of her face covered in blood, always crying, telling me that it hurt." Su Fengyan said in self-mockery, "In the past, I was most afraid of having nightmares about her. Later on, when I wanted to dream about her again, there was already no way." Su Fengyan's waist bent slightly, as if he couldn't bear the burden, but also as if he remembered someone. "When I was young, I didn't understand anything, saying a lot of things out of anger. I even said something to Su Zhao's face, roughly saying that I became Su Zhao's son, that it was 8 lifetimes of bad luck, that I was like this, that my mother was also like this. When I grew up, only then did I realize that Su Xiao actually already couldn't have done any better. Everything he could give me as a father he already gave me. He always talked about how high-spirited he had been when he was young, how many victories he had won and how much glory he had enjoyed. At that time, I always didn't have the patience to listen to him talk about these old and rotten grains. When I got impatient, I would say, Su Shao, a real man doesn't boast about his past achievements. Let's not blabber on and on. Okay? All the smart people in the world laughed at Su Shao for being a fool. He helped the late emperor conquer the world, but in the end, he had to guard against his son like he was guarding against a thief for 20 years. In fact, everyone was well aware that Su Shao would not rebel. If he wanted to rebel, the Central Plains would have long been divided into 2 rivers. But the more this was the case, the more Liang would take a yard after taking an inch. That was why the Zhao clan's son of heaven had Zhao Kai take the bottle to the western regions, had Chun Jibao cut off Beiliang's path of retreat, and forced the Su family's 300,000 cavalry to fight Beimang to the death. The Zhao clan's son of heaven used this method to help his son wear the dragon robe. In Zhao Zhuan's court, among his officials, there would be no martial artist Su Shao whose achievements shook the emperor. There would be no scholar Zhang Julu who cared about the people of the world. Within his territory, there would be no border officials who couldn't get rid of him. There would be no vassals who coveted the dragon throne. There would only be a severely weakened Beimang left behind for his son to complete the great undertaking that the Great Qin and Great Feng dynasties couldn't accomplish. Su Shao once said that the current son of heaven's magnanimity was far inferior to the late emperor, but he could be considered a good emperor. As Su Fengyan spoke, he squatted down and grabbed a handful of yellow sand, holding it tightly in his hand. Sui Xiegu sighed softly. Tantai Pingjing suddenly turned around and looked into the distance. There were a dozen or so riders approaching. Their armor was stained with blood, and their weapons and crossbows were broken. Su Fengyan stood up. When the dozen or so riders who originally wanted to use this precious water source to quickly replenish themselves saw the 3 people, they seemed to be conflicted. If there was no water, they and their warhorses wouldn't be able to withstand the pursuit of the enemy's black fox bars from several li away. The rider at the front waved his hand and charged towards the water source. The exhausted 14 riders dismounted from their horses. When they were filling their bags with water and the warhorses were brushing their noses, there were people carefully watching Su Fengyan and the other 2 in case anything unexpected happened. This place was already far away from the Beiliang border of the southern dynasty. The probability of encountering their own people was about the same as encountering the northern barbarians in Beiliang territory. These 14 riders were all elite riders with light armor and light crossbows. They were all tall and sturdy, and their horsemanship was exquisite. They also had the latest generation of cold blades at their waists. It could be seen that they were the best crossbowmen in the Beiliang frontier army. However, this time, they had probably encountered an enemy force of at least 100 riders. All of them were injured. One of the warhorses had reached the water source and swayed a few times before dying on the spot. The rider held back his tears and didn't look at his beloved warhorse. Without a word, the 2 riders beside him exchanged for a less damaged crossbow for him. This crossbowman who had lost his mount and was destined not to return to the border alive was even less likely to return on the same horse as his comrades. That would only cause the death of another comrade. This rider carried the light crossbow on his back and touched the cold blade at his waist. He grinned at the other crossbowmen and then turned to face the black fox bars that were pursuing them and intercepting military intelligence. At this moment, the leader of the crossbowmen, who had already mounted his horse, saw the young man with an extraordinary bearing. He smiled and said, "I'll give you 3 horses in exchange for a cold blade. How about it?" The man who looked like the leader of the crossbowmen was taken aback. He asked, "You're also from Liangzhou?" Su Fengyan nodded. "I'm a native of Liangzhou." The leader of the crossbowmen quickly said, "If that's the case, I can lend you my cold blade. However, I hope that young master can come find me at Wolf Sealing Pass later. My name is Zhu Geng. This time, my brothers and I owe you our lives. Young master steeds are all priceless. Even if we sold everything we had, we still wouldn't be able to afford them. Zhu Geng definitely won't be able to repay this favor in this lifetime." Zhu Geng isn't a hypocritical person. I only dare say that in the future, I'll kill 30 more northern barbarian bars for young master. Zhu Geng turned to the rider who had clearly gone to his death. Li Tingji, get back here. Get on my horse and return to Wolf Sealing Pass with me. Su Fengyan gave the 3 horses to Zhu Geng. When he handed over the reins, he said something that Zhu Geng didn't understand. However, he didn't have the time to think about it. 1 crossbowman for 50 riders. I owe you 36 lives. The 14 riders cupped their fists in thanks. Zhu Geng didn't forget to remind him, young master, be careful. There are 60 Black Fox barbarians and 300 Beimang light cavalry about 2 li behind us. Su Fengyan nodded. After the 14 crossbowmen were far away, he looked at the 2 battered war horses. He turned to Tantai Pingjing and Sui Xiagu and said, I'll have to trouble the 2 seniors to send these 2 horses to Wolf Sealing Pass. Then wait for me at the Governor-General's residence. Sui Xiagu was about to speak when he saw Tantai Pingjing's cold glare. He could only swallow his words. Su Fengyan's right hand held the borrowed Bailiang blade and slowly walked forward. His left hand, which had been holding a handful of sand, loosened its fingers. Yellow sand scattered into the air. He slowly walked towards the 300 riders. Next spring, the loquat tree in a small courtyard would sprout new buds and bloom new flowers. The next spring would be the same. However, he didn't know if he would be able to see it with his own eyes. Chapter 1257. During the wars of the spring and autumn period, scouts were the sharpest antennae of an army. They were rarely deployed on such a large scale. However, on the border of Liangmang it was the exact opposite. Scouts rarely went out alone to capture military intelligence. The reason was very simple. Both sides were at the peak of the use of scouts. Whether it was the degree of importance or the speed of attrition, it far exceeded that of the Central Plains. It had reached a level that the generals of the Central Plains found exaggerated. Once the 2 sides met, it often meant that one side was destined to be completely wiped out. When both sides had roughly the same level of individual combat and tacit cooperation, the number of people would determine who could leave the battlefield with important military intelligence. Northern Liang border armies' wandering crossbowmen shook the world under the heavens, while Northern Mang wasn't inferior in any way. Dongzhu's crowbar, Huang Songpu's roaming scout personally created in the past, as well as the Black Fox Bar who was known as the son of great General Lu Gu, were all the most outstanding scouts of the present age. Crossbowman Captain Zhu Geng led 50 cavalry deep into the heart of the desert. It was not only luck but also strength. After deducing a spy report through observation, he was intercepted and killed by Heihu Lanzi on his way back. Then, not only did the second Lanzi quickly join in the pursuit, Lu Gue, one of the commanders of the border army of the southern dynasties, received the report and did not hesitate to mobilize 300 light cavalry nearby. He was determined to catch this fish that had escaped the net. The cold wind whistled and the war flag fluttered. In a heavily guarded military tent, General Lu Gue's brows were tightly furrowed. He squatted beside a pot that was about to boil. During this period of time, he rarely looked at the map of the Bailiang border that countless spies had sacrificed their lives for. It was not that Lu Gue's power had fallen, nor was it that this famous general did not value the Bailiang cavalry. It was that even he, as the commander of the border, did not know where his side was going to focus on until 3 days ago. He did not know which unlucky place in the 3 northern provinces of Bailiang would be the breakthrough point for the army. Although the Murong and Yelu families were busy with their own affairs due to the turmoil in the grassland in their backyard, as one of the 2 pillars of the southern dynasties, the old Longguan aristocrats had always been at odds with the new military nobles represented by Lu Gue and Yang Yuanzhan. This time, they even jumped and cursed in the imperial court of the western dynasties and attacked together, begging the emperor to take back Dongzhu's military power. Huang Songpu had already retired and returned to his hometown, but he was almost dragged out and whipped by these angry Chinese tycoons. It could be seen how chaotic the southern dynasties was at the moment. The key was that General Dongzhua had been hiding all this time, as if he was determined to let the army of nearly 1 million consume their provisions in vain. Even if Lu Gue and Yang Yuanzhan wanted to say a few words for him, they could not. Instead, they would only add fuel to the fire. Lu Gui was temporarily in charge of the border defense military affairs of all the military towns in Gusai province. During wartime, even the prefect of discipline who had the same rank as him had to listen to him. This was a special case that had never happened in the history of Beimang. This was also a great privilege that the emperor had given to General Dong Zhuo. It should be noted that Beimang was different from Liang and the Central Plains. The prefect of discipline who controlled the mighty army was definitely not an administrator or a provincial governor. Thinking of this, Lu Gui had already smelled the unique aroma of brick tea, goat milk, and butter tea leaves mixed together. Lifting the lid of the pot, this general who used to be from a noble family in the Central Plains was in a good mood. He grabbed a handful of salt and threw it into the pot. Different from General Yang Yuanzhan who used to be a slave, and also different from Huang Songpu who had a glorious ancestor, Lu Gui's family was not in the upper class among the remnants of the northbound tribes. However, after arriving in the southern dynasties of Beimang, they would not be wantonly slaughtered like pigs or dogs. Lu Gui's status today was attributed to his hard study in the old country when he was young. It was also attributed to the military strategies he had read in those books. Because of him, Lu Gui's family had a second spring in Beimang. He was also worthy of the name of the resurgence of the family tree. However, after Lu Gui became famous, he was not like many of the remnants of the spring and autumn period who were nostalgic for the past or the extravagant nobles of Beimang who never drank the famous tea from the Central Plains. After arriving in Beimang, Lu Gui fell in love with the milk tea in the pot in front of him. He liked the strong fishy smell of goat milk and horse milk. After scooping a bowl of tea, Lu Gui put it to his nose and sniffed it. He held the bowl with one hand and slowly turned it. The descendants of his family seemed to be drinking a famous tea from the spring god lake. They did not hesitate to spend a lot of money. There were even young people who said that after conquering the Central Plains, they must have their own tea plantation on the island of the spring god lake. The general laughed. These children did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. Did they really think the Central Plains was made of paper? Even if the Central Plains were easy to bully, how could they cross the threshold of Beimang? He was afraid that, when the time came, Beimang would have to break a leg to cross it. Next, in the south, there was Chun Jibao who was sitting on a natural stronghold. This person used troops to turn something rotten into something magical. If he had 30,000 soldiers, he would be able to fight 100,000 strong soldiers. Moreover, on the Eastern Front, there was also the famous general of the spring and autumn period, Gu Jiantang. This time, the Guangling Road's internal strife had left the Eastern Front completely unscathed. Lu Gui stopped turning the teacup and said to himself, "In the end, the true enemies of Beimang's million-strong army are three people: Su Fengyan, Chun Jibao, and Gu Jiantang. Which one of them is easy to deal with?" Lu Gui drank a mouthful of tea. When it was bland, he threw in some salt and called out, "Lin Fu." A resolute general who had been waiting outside the tent lifted the curtain and walked in. Lu Gui raised the teacup in his hand. "Want a cup? I might not be in the mood in the future." The middle-aged general shook his head. Lu Gui did not force him. This fellow was his trusted aide and was once the main general of the Black Fox Guard. Later, Lu Gui felt that it was a waste of talent and gave him two options. He could either become a third-rank general with real power in his own army and continue his military career, or he could go to the Xijing Ministry of War as an assistant minister and live a peaceful life as an official. In the end, this fellow chose neither and insisted on being an ordinary guard. Lu Gui sighed in his heart. This man had seen life and death countless times. Why couldn't he let go of the meaningless word love? "My daughter is already married and I have a basket full of children. What's the use of you, Lin Fu, staying by this old man's side?" However, Lu Gui, who had never been sentimental, knew that these words were too hurtful and could not be said out loud. Lu Gui asked, "What about the Bailiang crossbowmen?" Lin Fu said in a low voice, "Don't worry, they won't be able to escape back to Bailiang. Moreover, even if they are lucky enough to find something, they will only think that our army is moving out to attack Liuzhou." Lu Gui raised his head, his expression solemn. He seemed to have lost his previous amiability, but he also did not deliberately reveal his power. Chapter 1258. However, Lin Fu was instantly covered in sweat. He lowered his head and said, "General, apart from the Black Fox Guards and 300 personal cavalry, I also asked for a master expert from the spider web spies. There is also news that the daughter of Jade Cicada Prefecture's governor, Princess Hong, who has followed." Lu Gui nodded and stared at this fellow. "Luckily, you didn't drink that cup of tea. Otherwise, I would have whipped you 10 times. Lin Fu, who was famous as one of the young generals in the South Dynasty, smiled awkwardly. He was like a child who had made a mistake and was almost beaten by Mr. Strict. Lu Gui drank a mouthful of strong tea and said softly, "As a general, perhaps a single wrong decision can cause many people to die. Lin Fu, do you know why the king of Beiliang doesn't care when people call him a butcher? Do you know what he feels guilty about?" Lin Fu shook his head. "I can't guess what the king of Beiliang is thinking." Lu Gui said softly, "Butcher is a title for killing millions of enemies. As a leader, being called that doesn't hurt at all. It's about the same as me whipping you 10 times. But if because of his own carelessness, he caused the death of the soldiers under his command who should have been able to survive, that would be unsettling." Lin Fu said softly, "General, I'm just a small personal guard. You can say that to Fatty Dong of the King of the North Court." Lu Gui was both angry and amused. He said helplessly, "I know you guys don't like Dong Zhuo. However, he does have true ability. In the future, you bunch of brats should stop talking so weirdly. Scram." Lin Fu left the tent. Behind him came Lu Gui's orders. "Send my orders. The commander's tent will move south and follow the army to Lu Prefecture." Lin Fu turned around and asked, "General, you're not going to finish that pot of tea?" Lu Gui asked calmly. "Then how many heads do my Lu brothers have to cut off?" Without another word, Lin Fu ran off to pass down the order. As he ran, he shouted, "Great General, from now on, I won't be a personal guard anymore. Last time, we agreed that I would be a third-grade general. Other than the 20,000 soldiers, the Black Fox Pen would also be under my command. If you don't say anything, I'll take it as a silent agreement." Lu Gui smiled and took the opportunity to drink another bowl of tea, because within a month, there were people from all walks of life who left their original stations and rushed to the border of the two prefectures. After they arrived, the Ministry of War in Xijing did nothing for a long time, and complaints were heard everywhere. As a result, 3 days ago, Dong Zhuo, the king of the South Courtyard, finally began to take action. Moreover, once he took action, it was dazzling. Even Lu Gui was surprised. The personal troops of border commander Lu Gui set out to kill their way to Luzhou. The coquettish woman, who treated this bloody pursuit as a chance to relax, stood on a high slope and raised her eyebrows. Beside her stood an old man in a brocade robe with an outstanding bearing. His nickname was the Dragon King. Beimang's devil was ranked 9th. But the Jianghu of Beimang acknowledged that this old man's ranking was too low. The noble woman of Beimang with a mink forehead was even more convinced. An old man who even the 6th-grade officials of the spider web had to respectfully address as martial uncle was ranked 9th? What a joke! She was the famous Princess Hongyan of Beimang's royal court. She was said to have countless male companions. Her father was the governor of Jade Cicada Prefecture, but he was punished by the emperor because of a slip of the tongue. She seemed to be the most aggrieved of the 8 governors, but she was still one of the most favored descendants of the Murong Empress. When she was still a little girl, she followed her father to the capital to meet the emperor. The empress, whose hands had not been washed clean of the blood of the yellow dragons, would smile as she held Princess Hongyan in her arms and let the child stand on her knees. That scene was unforgettable to many of the elders of the Yelu and Murong royal families. It was only at that time that people remembered that the woman was a woman. This infamous proud daughter of heaven had once personally gone to Liao City to pass a message to the city magistrate, Tao Qianji. It's not appropriate to go out during the Qingming festival. However, Tao Qianji did not listen and died in the heavy rain of the Qingming festival. She looked at the confrontation in the distance with a great disparity in numbers and asked, "Old Dragon King, why does that figure look so familiar?" The old man in brocade clothes smiled. Just by looking at his figure, he looks a bit like that handsome young man who was teased by the princess on the streets of Tuma Pass. The mink-forehead Princess Hongyan laughed. I remember now. He does look a bit like that guy. I even smacked his butt. In the distance, the lone man with the saber did not show any signs of dodging. He just went straight for the charging Black Fox Lanzi and the 200 light cavalry. The old man in brocade clothes narrowed his eyes. But just by looking at his aura, it's like the difference between heaven and earth. If the princess doesn't think that this old servant's eyesight is bad, we should turn around and leave as far as we can. Princess Hongyan was shocked. That guy is a profound finger realm expert at such a young age? But even if his profound finger realm is healed, he might not be able to escape from you and 400 cavalry. Princess Hongyan asked, Tianxiang? Is there such a person in Beiliang? Yuan Baixiong is younger and older than him. He doesn't have the leisure to come here for a stroll. The old man in brocade clothes shook his head. If I'm not wrong, it's that guy. Then the old man turned around and left. However, Princess Hongyan did not move because she knew who the old Dragon King was talking about was. She did not want to leave even more. The old man stopped and said with a frown, Princess, you will really die. That person has already discovered us. This old servant's leaving is just doing my best and leaving the rest to fate. This will let that person know that we have no intention of interfering. With her back to the Dragon King, the mink-forehead woman waved her hand with a smile. Old Dragon King, you go. I have to see this legendary person with my own eyes. I have to confirm. If he is really that young master I took advantage of back then, I will have profited even if I die here today. Also, Old Dragon King, don't even think about knocking me out. The old man sighed. If Princess Hongyan was determined not to leave, there was no point in him leaving. He did have the thought of knocking her out just now. She muttered, A good show is about to begin. Old Dragon King, do you really not want to see this person's elegance with your own eyes? Perhaps if you miss it once, you will miss it forever. The old man did not say anything. He had already arrived beside Princess Hongyan and looked into the distance together. There were more than 70 Black Fox Guards and 300 Iron Guards of the Lu army. In the eyes of this cavalry, this ant blocking their path would be killed in a single charge. Their real mission was to intercept and kill the 14 crossbowmen. Su Fengyan had been holding his blade with his left hand all this time. He did not draw his blade with his right hand. He stopped, flicked his wrist. The cold blade in his left hand was unsheathed. The scabbard stabbed into the sand beside him. His left hand held the blade in a reverse grip. Chapter 12:59. Looking at the scene on the other side of the narrow path, the old man in embroidered clothes asked, Princess, are you not afraid of death? The mink-forehead woman was clear-minded and said, Let's go. The Beimang spiderweb elder grabbed her by the shoulder and flew down the slope. They didn't stop until they were 200 feet away from the point of collision. Along the way, Princess Hongyan still had the mood to turn her head and admire the charging posture of those northern Mang cavalrymen. Their vigorous bodies rose and fell along with the horse's back, just like a person's breathing. It was filled with a kind of dynamic beauty that was pleasing to the eye. The curved blades in the hands of the Beimang soldiers had a larger arc than the cold blades. This kind of arc gave the Beimang war blades a greater cleaving force. Combined with their height and their innate strength that exceeded that of the men of the Central Plains, a single cleave of their blades was like a hot knife through butter. Princess Hongyan heard the rough shouts of the Beimang men. She firmly believed that this kind of sound would resound throughout the Central Plains. It wasn't something that a master of the martial arts role could block, nor was it something that the 300,000 soldiers of Beimang could block. She stroked the mink forehead and looked into the distance with narrowed eyes. She saw that the person blocking the path of the millions of soldiers of the Beimang dynasty held the cold blade in a reverse grip and held it horizontally in front of his chest. A crack seemed to have appeared at the height of the horse's chest among the 3 Black Fox riders in the front row, which then expanded in an instant. The war horses and riders continued to charge forward, but they were cut in two. The lower half of the war horse and the rider's legs fell to the yellow sand, while the upper half of the warhorse and the rider whose legs had been cut in an instant fell to the ground further ahead. It wasn't just the front row. The dozen or so rows behind them were also in a similar situation. On the path 100 steps in front of the machete man, a large patch of blood instantly bloomed. Half of a warhorse's body, with its stomach exposed, slid forward while sticking to the sand. Behind the corpse of the warhorse was a ghastly bloody path. After the 30 or so riders whose legs had been cut off fell to the ground, they let out heart-wrenching cries. The invisible line was not at the end of its flight. In fact, it was still advancing rapidly. However, the Baimang cavalry behind it, especially the Black Fox Lanzi, sensed that something was wrong and leaped up high, abandoning their horses and drawing their swords. There were even knights who suddenly pulled the reins and jumped over the line that was cutting across. The knights at the back began to quickly deviate from a straight line and tried their best to make a large arc to evade the attack. Princess Hongyan asked excitedly, "Gang Chi?" The old Dragon King nodded. She asked again, "How long and wide is the limit?" The embroidered-robed elder shifted his gaze to the rear of the cavalry and replied, "This blade is about 300 meters long and 6 meters wide, but that's all it took." She clicked her tongue and said, "Wouldn't it be very impressive on the battlefield?" The old man said calmly, "On a large battlefield, there are hidden death warriors like Spider Web, who only target the experts of Jianghu. Moreover, there are also archers, foot crossbows, and even catapults. If ordinary experts dared to play like this, they would be the first living target to die. Of course, this person in front of us is an exception. If he really wants to fight to the death like the Sword Emperor of Shishu, I'm afraid he would need a few top experts to pin him down. Taking a step back, when such an expert's chi is exhausted to the point of exhaustion, he can still leave whenever he wants. No one can stop him. After all, it's just a matter of taking a breath. With such a breath, unless one is also an expert in martial arts, one would not be able to seize this fleeting opportunity. However, everything in this world has its vanquisher. If this person dares to charge into the enemy's formation, our god of war would naturally not mind taking his head personally. Most of the people who are a match for 10,000 men in the army are short-lived. After proving that they have the strength, they die." Princess Hongyan nodded in agreement and said, "This is also the reason why the experts of Jianghu are unwilling to participate in the killing on the battlefield. It's too depressing to die just like that. If they reincarnate in their next life, it's hard to guarantee that they will be reincarnated into a good body." That person seemed to raise his arm and lightly swiped the blade a few times. 6 or 7 Black Fox Lanzi on the road who jumped off their horses exploded into pieces in the air. Following his backhanded blade movements, the range of his movements was extremely small. A warhorse that had jumped high in the air had yet to step on the ground when an invisible line ran from the left side of the horse's abdomen to the right shoulder of the rider on the horse's back. It was cut into 2 halves. Another large splash of blood spilled onto the ground. A rider who was drawing his bow and shooting an arrow had his head split apart along with his horse's head. Between the swordsman and the 300 riders, there was already a large pool of blood. Then, this pool of blood continued to move forward rapidly as the swordsman continued to raise his hand. These armored riders were easily cut apart like tofu by the blade. Princess Hongyan said with a face full of regret, "They're just ants." The old Dragon King, who had no sympathy for this tragedy, said calmly, "It's true that they're ants. However, the reason why it's so miserable is because there are too few of them. As long as the ants gather into an uncountable number of ants, then not only the West Shu Sword Emperor will be bitten to death." The old man continued, "There are masters in Bailiang who can single-handedly decide the battle of 10,000 men. However, there are only a few of them. This one, Yuan Zuozong and Su Yanbing. Yuan Zuozong was the commander of the cavalry. When the situation reached a critical point where he had to save the situation, it meant that the entire northern Liang border army was almost finished. That spear Immortal Wang Xiu's junior apprentice brother is most likely to appear in the early stages of the battle. No one would be willing to leave such a sharp spear in the armory without drinking blood." Princess Hongyan nodded. "That's right. If it's his turn, the king of Bailiang has to go to the battlefield to kill the enemy. Not to mention the Bailiang frontier army. I'm afraid that the 4 states of Bailiang will be ours. She suddenly laughed happily. Old Dragon King. He's temporarily holding the title of #1 in the world. However, no matter how powerful he is, he can only watch the 300,000 soldiers of the Su family die one by one. Does he feel helpless? The old man thought for a while and laughed. If I were him, I would have run away long ago. The world is vast. Where can't I go? Where can't I be free? Chapter 1260. She asked curiously. Since killing at the border is the same, why doesn't this person just sneak into our palace and start a massacre? Isn't it quite good at disturbing the morale of the army? The old Dragon King didn't know whether to laugh or cry at her naive thoughts. He sighed and said, after reaching the celestial state, it's easy for experts to sense each other. Even if he can kill 1 or 2 cities, even if the entire Aquarius state bleeds for thousands of miles, then what? Would he be besieged and killed by masters like Tuoba, Hong Jingyan and Jian Chenjin? Princess Hongyan curled her lips and said, why are you still so restrained after becoming an invincible expert? How boring. In the past, I've only heard that the half-saints of the celestial state of Confucianism, Buddhism and Taoism didn't dare to kill easily because they were afraid of being tainted by karma. It turns out that these pure martial artists aren't much better. The old man's face was bitter and he said some words of conscience. I have no choice but to wait for death here with you, princess. Isn't that even more boring? The old man looked at the sky for no reason and sighed. Between the heavens and the earth, with the heavens and the earth, who isn't a puppet with their hands and feet tied? There are people who are lucky enough to jump out of this cage, but there's definitely no one who can break it. Princess Hongyan was surprised. It's over? The thunder is loud, but the rain is too light. I haven't had enough fun watching it. While they were talking, the knight of Baimang didn't disappoint this noble surnamed Yelu. When the less than 300 riders all stopped their horses, that person also stopped his blade. A famous archer in the Lu battalion seized this perfect opportunity to draw his bow into a full moon. The bowstring released a loud bang and shot an arrow at the young swordsman. The other 2 burly knights with big bows on their backs followed suit. They didn't need to deliberately prepare their arrows. Instead, they drew their bows and shot out an arrow in one go. 3 sharp arrows pierced through the air, the arrowheads all aimed accurately at the swordsman's face. What happened next left these seasoned elites flabbergasted. The 3 arrows hovered quietly in the air, maintaining their slanting postures. The saberman sheathed the cold saber that the Baimang border army hated the most. 1 eagle feather arrow and 2 ordinary feather arrows. He reached out to grab the eagle plume arrow, which was known in the Central Plains as faster than a hawk and unable to be shaken by a strong wind, and threw it out with a backhand. The archer, who had subconsciously grabbed the reins after shooting the arrow, had his head pierced through by the arrow. His entire body was pulled back by the huge force. His hands pulled the reins, and the warhorse raised its front hooves. The knight's corpse fell off the horse. The warhorse that had been with the dead knight day and night still seemed to be in a daze. It stepped lightly on its fine hooves, turned around, and used its nose to touch its master who had fallen to the ground. A black fox that looked like a leader turned around and looked at the northern sky with great nostalgia. After turning his head again, he faced the young expert with terrifying strength. This Lanzi suddenly squeezed his horse's belly and took the lead in a crazy charge that was tantamount to suicide. The second warhorse began to follow, then the third, the fourth. In the end, none of the riders in the entire cavalry turned around and retreated. All of them began to charge. Seeing this tragic scene, Princess Hongyan bit her lip and said softly, "Let's go." The old man was puzzled, but he did not hesitate. He grabbed her shoulder and retreated. She closed her eyes and felt the strong wind blow past her ears. She said, "If we allow the news of them dying here for no reason to spread back to the grasslands, then their deaths will be in vain." The old Dragon King did not say anything. Nearly 400 riders had chased down 14 riders, but they had not succeeded. If they allowed the enemy crossbowmen to send back information, even if these Baimang warriors had all died in battle, their parents, wives, children, and even their entire tribes on the grasslands would be implicated. And these people were originally waiting for their families to return home with military merits and food. Even if they returned empty-handed, it was good that they were alive. After allowing the 2 big fish to leave, Su Fengyan helped the 14 crossbowmen cover the retreat. He hung the cold saber at his waist and faced the aggressive Beimang cavalry. He began to run. The leader of the Black Fox fence was the first to reach him. Su Fengyan jumped up. The leader was still in the posture of raising his arm and slashing his saber. He slapped the man's head with his palm. Both the man and his horse were smashed into the yellow sand. The warhorse's abdomen was stuck to the sand pit. However, Su Fengyan had a head in his hand. He pulled it out and threw it at the second Black Fox fence. The fence's chest was blown apart. Su Fengyan quickly fell to the ground. With a shake, his shoulders hit the sides of the warhorses on both sides. The horse's hooves left the ground, and the 2 riders fell to the side. One of the riders charged forward fiercely. However, when it was about 10 feet away from Su Fengyan, the rider and the horse were crushed by the majestic Qi, bursting into a cloud of bloody mist. The spider web spy hidden between the Black Fox fence and the elite Lu cavalry broke through the bloody mist without warning. The tip of his sword pointed directly at Su Fengyan's forehead. Su Fengyan completely ignored the tip of the sword. He stretched out his hand and pressed down on the head of the spy. Then he slammed the spy to the ground. The tip of the sword shattered, and the blade snapped. The spy's body bounced on the yellow sand. First, blood flowed out of his 7 orifices. Then, his meridians were broken, and blood seeped out of his entire body. This corpse was kicked up by Su Fengyan and slammed into a warhorse in front of him. After the dozen or so riders at the front died without any resistance, the surviving riders finally lost the courage to charge to their deaths. Some people began to retreat. There were hot-blooded people in the world who were not afraid of death. There were also people who were afraid of death but could calmly die for it. However, these brave and skilled Beimang elites did not wish to die at the hands of an enemy whose name and identity they did not even know. Su Fengyan stamped his foot slightly and stretched out a hand. On the ground in front of him, yellow sand swords rose from the ground. After about half an incense stick's worth of time, the old man in embroidered clothes, who had brought Princess Hongyan and dashed for more than 20 li, straightened his back in an instant. A cold voice rang out from behind him. "The 2 of you are old acquaintances I met at Tumbling Horse Pass. Do you not value your lives at all?" Then, Princess Hongyan realized that her buttocks were lightly padded. The person behind her smiled and said, "The old debt is settled, so you can die now." Chapter 1261. There are still 2 chapters left, but it's definitely late, especially the 3rd chapter. Every dog has its day. At the Tumbling Horse Pass, the old Dragon King escorted the woman with a mink headscarf into the dangerous northern Liang border pass. She saw the young man with a pair of beautiful eyes and thought that he was just a disciple of an aristocratic family who knew a little about martial arts. She wanted to tease him, so she did as she pleased and touched his buttocks. Who would have thought that the tables would turn so quickly? Today, after he patted her buttocks, the princess, the only descendant of the royal family who could make the Empress of Beimang willing to play with her grandson, did not even have the courage to turn around. The old man in embroidered clothes was indeed the ancestor of Beimang's spider web. He gently pushed Princess Hongyan's shoulder and pushed her far away. Her life was hanging by a thread, so she did not care about controlling her strength and fell into the yellow sand more than 10 feet away. After sending her out of danger temporarily, the old Dragon King let out a light shout. His voice was like spring thunder, and his qi flowed like a flood. Thousands of tiny cracks appeared on his luxurious brocade clothes that were not inferior to those made in Jiangnan. The old Dragon King did not turn around. He did not even turn his head. He raised his arm and smashed backward. The sleeves on his arm instantly turned into fine powder. Dragon King Hulu Tieguan was an expert who had been famous in northern Mang for a long time. Before Tuoba Bodhisattva, Murong Baoding, Hong Jingyan, and the other new talents had risen to prominence, the heaven-warping Hulu Tieguan was once viewed as a peak expert who could block spear immortal Wang Xiu's spear with his bare hands. Hulu Tieguan's close-quarters combat skills couldn't be said to be weak, especially his tenacious muscles and bones. Before Murong Baoding obtained the great reputation of immovable wisdom king, he had even asked Hulu Tieguan for guidance on body-tempering secret techniques. When the Empress of Beimang was purging the Jianghu forces, Hulu Tieguan, who was summoned, showed off his skills. 8 siege chariots with 200 strong men, each threw 8 stones weighing 180 pounds at the same time towards the Dragon King, Hulu Tieguan, who was standing 2,000 feet away. The old man smashed the stones with his fist in the air and did not let any of the stones fall to the ground. The old but vigorous Hulu Tieguan's arm swung out like wind and thunder. Su Fengyan stretched out his right hand and casually grabbed the old Dragon King's wrist. He snapped his fingers and broke Chongqing. Hulu Tieguan instantly felt that the rapidly flowing qi in his body was cut off, like a fast ship suddenly encountering a chain across the river. Moreover, this chain was not only in one place, but in 6 important acupoints of his body, as if it had forcibly set up 6 barriers in his body. Even if you are a fine horse that can travel 1,000 li in a day, under the heavy snow, you will not be able to move forward. Hulu Tieguan was trembling all over. Blood spurted out from the gaps between his teeth. Even if he was injured, he still wanted to break through those iron chains. He tried his best to connect all the meridians in his body. The old Dragon King was very decisive and ruthless. However, since Su Fengyan had made a move, he would not hesitate. He raised his left hand like a knife and placed it on Hulu Tieguan's shoulder and ear. Then he slapped his left hand and grabbed the old man's wrist. Hulu Tieguan's head was violently shaken. What was even more shocking was that the old man's entire arm was pulled out from his body by Su Fengyan. At the same time, the right side of Hulu Tieguan's head was densely covered in bright red threads. They were like countless red snakes wantonly swimming in his skin. Hulu Tieguan's strong points were his extraordinary strength, dragon tendons, and iron bones. He was incomparably proficient in close combat. However, he definitely did not know that if he let Su Fengyan get close to him and tremble, it would be tantamount to letting the Liang dynasty's Han Wudi, who was known as the Land Immortal, get close to him. And the only person in the world who was proficient in killing Celestial State experts, Han Shengxian, should be able to kill a finger Celestial State expert. Hulu Tieguan, whose arm had been torn off, had his feet deeply sunk into the sand. His eyes were wide open as he stared into the distance, not moving at all. Su Fengyan gently let go of the arm and turned around to look at the insufferably arrogant woman with the marten forehead. This sorrowful Princess Hongyan was sitting on the ground in a daze. She did not know why the old Dragon King, who was rarely matched in her mind, was motionless. She only knew that the old man was definitely seriously injured. She would never have thought that the legendary figure of Beimang, Hulu Tieguan, had already breathed his last. Su Fengyan looked at this woman who had probably forgotten to run away. Neither of them spoke. She suddenly shouted in a stern voice, "Old Dragon King! Kill him! He's the king of Beiliang, Su Fengyan. As long as you kill him, I'll personally go to His Majesty and ask for your reward. You can be a great general and be the prefect of discipline." Princess Hongyan was not stupid. On the contrary, she was an extremely intelligent and shrewd woman. Otherwise, she would not have been able to deal with the 2 surnames Yelu and Murong. She cried out, "Hulu Tieguan, why don't you make a move?" With a face full of tears, she choked out, "Old Dragon King, at least move a little bit." Su Fengyan looked at this woman's marten forehead, but his left hand was already on the cold saber at his waist. Princess Hongyan suddenly calmed down. She stood up and patted off the yellow sand and dust on her dress. She tidied up her messy black hair and the slanted sable scarf on her forehead. She slowly asked, "Can I choose a way to die that isn't ugly?" Chapter 1262. Su Fengyan did not answer this question. Instead, he smiled and said, "Do you have anything that can be exchanged for your life? For example, the movements of Dong Zhuo and Lu Gui's armies? Or do you have any news about the orphans of Yelu de Tong? Or else you can talk about the 2 large camps of heavy cavalry in Beimang." The corners of her mouth twitched. She did not hide her sarcasm at all. Su Fengyan's thumb gently pushed the knife out of its sheath. At this moment a rider galloped over. On the back of the horse was a young rider whose face was covered in blood. He even had an extra horse with him. Looking at his attire and accessories, it was neither fish nor fowl. He had the armor and saber of the Lu Centurion, as well as the unique short saber of Black Fox Lang. On his back was a huge bow with carved feathers. It was likely that this rider had made a fortune from the dead. Princess Hongyan turned her head to look at the rider who had just survived a disaster. Her eyes were full of disdain and hatred. She did not need to think to know that this was a traitor. On the Baimang grasslands, this kind of man had the lightest bones. The young rider who had relied on horsemanship and archery to enter the personal cavalry of the Lu general stopped his horse and panted heavily. He also looked at the woman with the mink hair covering her forehead. Previously, in the army camp, he had only seen her a few times from a distance. At that time, one of the generals had respectfully led her and her entourage to the general's tent. He did not even dare to think that he would be able to talk to this kind of rich and noble woman in his lifetime. As for the disdain in her eyes at this moment, this young man who had indeed defected couldn't help but lower his eyelids. However, he quickly raised his head. He did not look at the woman who made people feel ashamed of their inferiority. Instead, he looked at the slender back of the swordsman. His body began to tremble uncontrollably. The previous scene was still vivid in his mind. Including him, the 300 riders began to retreat and flee. This swordsman of similar age had cast sand flying swords out of thin air. When he turned around, he saw with his own eyes that the swords had pierced through the backs of his fellow soldiers. Occasionally, a knight would use his scimitar to shatter the flying swords, but he could not stop the second flying sword from piercing through his chest. A comrade was pierced through his shoulder by a flying sword and fell off his horse. His entire body was nailed into the sand. While the man was chasing after the comrade, he casually stretched out his hand and pressed down. The injured comrade, who was struggling for his life a few feet away, sank into the ground, stirring up a cloud of yellow sand. Then he disappeared without a sound. After one of the Black Fox Lanzi fell off his horse, his entire chest was pierced by a flying sword. He staggered as he charged towards this person, but this person brushed past him. The Black Fox Lanzi's legs left the ground, and his head seemed to have been hit by a heavy hammer. He leaned back and fell heavily to the ground. A centurion of the personal guards of the Lu army was lying on the ground, barely breathing. That person used the cold blade in his hand, which had yet to be unsheathed, to knock lightly on his head. Just like that, his entire head exploded. When that person got closer and closer to him, as if possessed, he no longer urged his horse to run wildly. Instead, he turned his horse around and blocked the path. However, he did not go to his death. Instead, he waited for death. He did not know what he was doing. He only watched as that person continuously controlled the flying sword to kill people. If there was someone next to him who had not yet breathed their last, he would use the cold blade in his scabbard or a newly forged flying sword to finish them off expressionlessly. At that moment, in the eyes of this little pawn who was in a state of death, the entire sky was like a swarm of flying swords. Then, these flying swords wove together into a vast net. There were 6 or 7 Black Fox Lanzi who were fighting like trapped beasts. They passed by the dazed pawn, roaring as they charged towards that person. Then, both the riders and their horses were carried into the sky by the flying swords with astonishing penetrative power. In the end, they fell to the ground together. In his eyes, for a few moments, he seemed to see that person breathing in and out. One breath was as fine as a drop of water. One breath was like a gently trembling lotus leaf. One breath was like a whale swallowing heaven and earth. For some reason, that person brushed past him but did not kill him. When he was the only one left alive among the 300 riders, that person appeared by his side. Using fluent Baimang language, he ordered him to pick any armor, swords, and arrows he wanted. Then, he asked him to bring an extra warhorse and leave with him. Probably because he felt that he had already died once, the young rider at that time had forgotten his fear. After returning from the gates of hell, he still had the mood to pick up those good items that he had long been envious of. He changed into a good horse, put on armor, equipped himself with a war blade, and carried a large bow on his back. Not a single item was left behind. The young man even changed into a new pair of sturdy leather boots for himself. The wind swept up the yellow sand. The only ones left alive were these 3 people and 2 horses. Princess Hong Yen looked at Su Fengyan. She pointed at the young rider and said through gritted teeth, "You killed him!" Su Fengyan used a gaze that looked like he was sizing up a madman. He looked mischievously at this most noble woman of the imperial family in the desert. "He's worth much more than you." Su Fengyan continued, "He won't die. But I'll give you one last chance. As long as you can take out something valuable enough to buy your life, I'll promise not to kill you." Princess Hong Yen screamed crazily, "Kill him! This kind of person doesn't deserve to be a Beimang man." Su Fengyan raised his arm and made a cold gesture of chopping at the young rider. The rider steadied his breathing and began to charge forward with his blade without hesitation. Princess Hong Yen was completely dumbfounded. She could allow herself to die at the hands of the king of Beiliang, but she would never allow herself, a princess of Beimang, the only daughter of the Yushan province's provincial magistrate, who was deeply doted on by the empress, to die under the blade of a grassland trader. Moreover, this nameless coward was so despicable. She smiled bitterly and looked at Su Fengyan with hatred. Then, she quickly pulled out a dagger and stabbed it toward her own heart. Chapter 1263. The sun was setting in the west, and the 2 riders were riding slowly on a flat sandy land commonly known as Longan. 30 miles to the south was Hutu City, the most majestic city in Beiliang's border. There were 30,000 elite soldiers, 3,000 heavy cavalry, 6,000 light cavalry, and more than 20,000 infantry inside and outside the city. Even if the people in the city were not listed as soldiers, as long as they were in the prime of their lives, they could put on armor and fight on horseback in a hurry. Behind Hutu City was the newly established Huayang Pass of the Protectorate of Northern Liang. To the left and right of Huayang Pass were the 2 great pass cities of Liuya and Taifeling, both of which had more than 10,000 soldiers. Unlike Hutu City, which had an absolute advantage in terms of infantry, Liuya and Taifeling were almost entirely composed of cavalrymen in light armor. Clearly, they were different from Hutu City, which was mainly used to stop the Northern Mang's army from advancing south. These 2 border cities, which were slightly inferior in scale, were more responsible for taking the initiative to attack. Behind the first line of defense was the second line of defense, with Jinyuan, Qinghe, and Grave as the fulcrum, and Shenkan and Shenwu as the flanks in the north of Liangzhou, followed by the Great Snow Dragon Cavalry, which was stationed at the border of Liangzhou all year round, and the 2 deputy commanders of infantry and cavalry, Chen Yunshui and He Zhonghu's army. Coupled with the crisscrossing watchtowers of Wubao Castle, there was no doubt that the northern border of Liangzhou was the most difficult battlefield in Beiliang. Generally speaking, Beimang was the least likely to attack the heavily guarded northern line of Liangzhou. If the northern barbarians really wanted to open their mouths and take over this place, it would not be as simple as breaking teeth and swallowing blood. Compared to northern Liang's Liangzhou's northern line, Yozhou's side was mostly infantrymen. That was why Infantry Great Commander Yen Wenlwan's tent was also located there. Regardless of whether it was the terrain of Yozhou's northern line or the distribution of troops, it all decided that Yuzhou would be a typical offensive and defensive battle between the nomads of the north and the farmers of the central plains, one side attacking, one side defending. It wasn't like northern Liang's northern line, where they relied on Su family's armored cavalry to fight northern Mang's cavalry on horseback. Originally, the Dragon Elephant Cavalry was stationed in the middle of Liangzhou and Liangzhou, so they could support both sides at any time and even roam around looking for opportunities. However, with the establishment of the 4th province, Liuzhou, and the 30,000 Longxiang army stationed there, a crack appeared in the close relationship between Liangzhou and Liangzhou. The number 1 city in the northwest of the Liang dynasty wasn't the provincial capital of the northern Liang, Liangling, and Nether provinces, but rather this tiger-head city that appeared out of nowhere and looked down on northern Mang. On the border of Liangzhou, there were some passes like Tuma Pass for merchants to enter and leave Liangmang, but to the north of Liangzhou, there was none. This place was destined to be filled with smoke signals and 100 battles, but never the sound of the camel bells of the caravans. Although there were only 2 riders, one of them was dragging a wretched woman whose hands were tied up. She was covered in dust, her lips were dry and cracked, and the pair of delicate embroidered shoes on her feet, which looked like those of a graceful girl from Jiangnan, were also in tatters, revealing her bloody toes. Her body was on the verge of collapse, but she was still holding on. When she was able to raise her head and look into the distance towards Tigerhead City that was rumored to be most fond of displaying the heads of northern Mang captives, because of this untimely pause, she was dragged to the ground by the warhorse. That horseman didn't turn around. She struggled with all her might to get up, or else she would be dragged towards Tigerhead City like this. However, she was already too exhausted to stand up, only able to turn around. A wave of scorching pain came from her back as she slid across the gravel. This type of pain didn't come from how great the pain was in an instant, but rather from the endless, bit-by-bit accumulation. That Beimang rider who was following orders couldn't help but turn his head to shoot a glance. This woman who was sitting high up in the clouds fell off the altar just like that, and in the end was dragged forward by him and his mount like a dog. He turned his head to look at the rider in front of him. He didn't know why this person didn't kill him, and he also didn't know why he didn't kill her. In the distance, there was a commotion. A group of several hundred riders with a majestic aura shook the earth as they approached. His heart contracted violently. This was the first time in his life that he had seen such a large number of Bailiang cavalry. He also quickly discovered that the Bailiang cavalry was different from the Lu cavalry he used to be in. The Lu cavalry was undoubtedly brave and ruthless when they broke through enemy lines and killed the enemy. After he joined the army, he was also like this. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to become one of General Lu Gui's personal guards. However, the feeling these northern Liang cavalry gave him was even more frightening. Previously, when he fought with the crossbowmen, it wasn't that obvious. He only felt that those well-known northern Liang crossbowmen's strength was indeed astonishing. However, when their numbers exceeded 300, it gave him an extremely strange feeling, as if these 300 to 400 cavalry were a single entity. When they urged their horses and brandished their whips, it was filled with a type of forbearance and restraint that would make all of the northern Mang's brave warriors feel extremely uncomfortable. The Huta city garrison in front of him even had the same degree of movement every time their bodies rose and fell along with the backs of their horses. He had only heard that the 2 large groups of heavy cavalry that had been raised with countless amounts of gold and silver could truly advance side by side when they were completely spread out in formation to charge in a single line. These 400 riders dismounted almost at the same time. The leading middle-aged rider knelt on one knee. He lowered his head and cupped his fists. General Lu Jinu pays his respects to the prince. Then the 400 riders said in unison, "Respects to the prince." Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Rise, all of you. This time, I've troubled General Lu to come out of the city to welcome me." The young captive behind Su Fengyan, who could still ride a horse and put on armor, was stunned for a moment. He couldn't quite wrap his head around it. However, when he saw General Lu, who was wearing armor and carrying a crossbow and looked exactly like the rider behind him, stand up, he seemed to be a cripple. Chapter 1264. Then he knew who this plain-looking lame general was. He was Bailiang's #1 border general, Huta City's guard General Lame Lu. He didn't know who Lu Jinu was, but almost every soldier with the surname Lu had heard of this legendary Lame Lu in the desert. This person was different from Beimang's valiant generals, who were cursed at in Beimang the more they performed. Lame Lu was recognized as a great general in the world by the scholars of Beimang's southern dynasty. He governed the army strictly, but outside of the battlefield, he treated the soldiers like his own children. He had 2 sons and 2 daughters. His sons had died at the border, and his youngest son had died at the age of 16. Both of his daughters had married his subordinates, and both of them had become widows. Lame Lu was never merciful to his enemies, but he never killed the innocent. 14 years ago, during a long-distance revenge raid, he went deep into the heart of Gusai province and beheaded tens of thousands of people along the way. His leg had been pierced by a captive woman with a dagger, but Lame Lu still didn't kill her. He only left behind a sentence that no one knew whether it was true or false, but was widely spread on the grasslands. No matter if it's our Bailiang or your Baimang, only when all the men are dead will it be your women's turn. Lu Jinu accompanied Su Fengyan to the majestic Tiger Head city. More than half of his life was spent there. Looking at the tall city walls, the eyes of this military general, who had achieved great feats on the battlefield, were unusually warm. The 400 elite riders behind them slowly turned their horses around and returned. They couldn't help but glance at the two strange people. The young man riding the horse was dressed in northern barbarian attire and carried a lot of weapons. He was dragging a woman with a mink forehead who could only walk pitifully. After entering the city, Su Fengyan took a bath and changed his clothes. Lu Jinu and a few Huta city captains stood respectfully at the steps of the outer courtyard. The last time Su Fengyan patrolled the border as the new Prince Liang, he stopped at Huayang Pass and didn't come here. It was said that the captains at that time complained that this prince looked down on their Huta city and treated the soldiers of Huta city as the children of Bailiang's stepmother. The captain who led the 3,000 heavy cavalry openly declared that if he had the ability, he would let the cowardly garrison at Huayang Pass practice martial arts with him. He didn't want to bully the cavalry of Huayang Pass because they were light cavalry. At worst, he could borrow another 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers from them. He could still beat those guys without 3 rounds of charge. Su Fengyan saw a strong man who pretended to be calm but was obviously a little restrained. He waved his hand and motioned for the pillars of Huta city to sit down and talk. With Lu Jinu's experience and military achievements, he could talk calmly with the old Prince Liang. Of course, he wouldn't be at a loss when facing Su Fengyan, the new prince of Bailiang. He calmly sat on the stone bench. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Ma Jili, who had scolded him the most after drinking, move the stone bench and sit at the back like a shy little girl who didn't dare to see her lover. Su Fengyan tilted his head, as if he was looking for someone. He deliberately asked with a smile, "General Lu, is Captain Ma, who said that even if he can't beat me in martial arts, he can drink me down?" Lu Jinu held back his laughter and didn't speak. The captains, who were as rough as the sandstorm in the frontier fortress, couldn't help but laugh out loud. Their laughter was full of straightforward kindness. No matter how feminine a man was, he would probably be hardened by the scorching sun here year after year. No matter how narrow-minded a man was, he would probably be bullied by the vast sky here day after day. Ma Jili straightened his back and stuck his head out from behind his comrade's back. "Reporting to Wang Ye," he said. "Lowly officer is here. If you, senior, are really angry and want lowly officer to eat a whip, lowly officer will have no objection. But when I'm being whipped, can you find a place where my subordinates can't see? Otherwise, I'll be laughed at by those guys." Su Fengyan obviously didn't want to bicker with this man. He asked, "General Lu, can everyone drink?" Lu Jinu nodded and joked, "Of course, everyone can drink. That's how it is when these people fight. When it comes to drinking, everyone is number one. However, Ma Jili and Chu Hanqing both have to be on night patrol. As long as the others don't get too drunk, it's fine." Su Fengyan grunted. "Then let's stop drinking. We can only make up for what we owe in the future." Lu Jinu turned his head and shouted, "Ma Jili, go with Chu Hanqing and bring 2 jars of wine here, then go on night patrol." Ma Jili was relieved. He ran out of the courtyard with another captain and quickly returned with 2 jars of green ant wine. Feeling guilty, Ma Jili didn't dare to stay any longer. He wanted to run away quickly. Chu Hanqing, the elegant captain of Huta city, hesitated for a moment. He looked at Su Fengyan and asked, "Your Highness, I can't drink tonight. I don't know when and where I can drink next time. Can I use an empty bowl to offer a toast to your Highness?" Su Fengyan nodded. Chu Hanqing raised the empty bowl high. Su Fengyan stood up and drank the green ant wine in one gulp. Ma Jili asked nervously, "Your Highness, how about I also offer you a toast?" Su Fengyan smiled and drank another bowl. Su Fengyan sat back down on the stone bench. He looked at the border officers who all had sincere smiles on their faces and asked, "General Lu, is there anything else Huta city needs? Feel free to ask." Lu Jinu held the bowl in one hand and rested the other on his lame leg. He shook his head with a smile and said, "There's nothing else. Su Fengnian didn't say anything else. He drank silently with these old generals of northern Liang, who were already over 40 years old. In the end, Lu Jinu only said one sentence. Since your highness is sitting here, then I can say something that I thought I couldn't say. Huda City has more than 40,000 people. Today, they've all drunk your highness farewell wine. Even if they die, they have no regrets. Chapter 1265. When Lu Jinu and the other generals left the courtyard, Su Fengnian had the guards outside call for the two captives. Elsewhere, Commandery Princess Hongyan was wolfing down food. When she reluctantly walked into the courtyard, her clothes were still ragged, but her mouth was greasy. When she crossed the threshold, she even burped. This made the Lu cavalry soldier beside her, who was still wearing his armor and carrying his saber and bow, feel curious. He probably realized that a woman like her was not truly otherworldly after all. There was still half a jar of green ant wine left on the table. Clearly, Lu Jinu and the others had shown mercy. Su Fengnian picked up the wine bowl and pointed at a few stone stools. Commandery Princess Hongyan sat down. The young cavalry soldier, who respected Su Fengnian more and more like a god, still stood obediently. Commandery Princess Hongyan glanced at the wine jar and bowl on the table and subconsciously sniffed. She was not afraid of itching when she had so many lice, so she poured herself a bowl of wine. She had tasted green ant wine at Falling Horse Pass, and even in the imperial court and the capital. She did not think it tasted that good before, but today, the wine burned from the tip of her tongue to her throat, and then to her stomach. Her entire body instantly warmed up. She felt warm and full. At the same time, she looked at Su Fengnian with more provocation. She knew that Su Fengnian did not let her commit suicide, so it would be harder for her to die than to live. Of course, this was not necessarily a good thing. Before entering Tiger Head City, she had thought of countless sinister ways Su Fengnian could humiliate her as Commandery Princess Hongyan. However, looking at the current situation, while the situation was indeed terrible, it was still within her acceptable range. She raised her head and drank the wine in the bowl in one big gulp. Wiping the corner of her mouth, she said with a charming smile, "What? Does your highness want me to serve you in bed? Then why don't you let me change into a clean set of clothes?" Su Fengnian asked in return, "Do you need me to send you a mirror so you can look at yourself?" Princess Hongyan flew into a rage out of humiliation. Just as she was about to raise her hand to throw the wine bowl away, she quickly suppressed this impulse. She silently poured another bowl of wine. Every bowl she could get was a bowl. Su Fengnian ignored the featherless phoenix. He turned his head to look at the rider who called himself Chifu Longguan and said, "You are very talented in martial arts. That is why I did not kill you." There was another reason that Su Fengnian did not mention. From the eyes of the dragon crown, one could not see the hatred that even an outsider like Princess Hongyan would have. Even if a person could hide their expression and eyes, the flow of their qi could not be hidden from Su Fengnian's eyes. The fluctuation of qi was directly related to happiness, anger, sorrow, and joy. This meant that Chifu Longguan, this unpolished jade that had been buried, might be able to go very far on the path of martial arts. Of course, the most important reason was that Su Fengnian hoped that there would be someone who could balance his disciple Yu Dilong in the future. This child was the youngest but was the eldest disciple. Unlike Wang Shang and Lu Yunzhang, whose personalities were clear, there were too many uncertainties. Su Fengnian did not want to have another Shenyuan Pan in his hands in the future. As for Chifu Longguan, he was like a random cat or dog picked up from the side of the road. His talent in martial arts was not the best that Su Fengnian had seen, but he was the most interesting. For example, Jiang and I and the charcoal girl of the Guanyin sect were called sword embryos. For example, Hong Shixiang and Zhao Ningxian of Longhu Mountain were the reincarnations of enlightened masters and were called Bodhi seeds. The Buddhist sect also had the concept of reincarnated spiritual children. As for Chifu Longguan, he was a little different. He had a bit of everything and nothing was pure. But this was precisely the case. He was most in line with Su Fengnian's martial arts journey. Moreover, in that battle, Chifu Longguan had truly caught the thin line between the breaths of Su Fengnian, this celestial being. In the present world, there were less than a handful of such people, and this nameless soldier was one of them. Chifu Longguan was only 18 years old, but he was already one of Lu Gui's personal cavalry. One had to know that the number 1 saber user, Gu Jiantang, might not even be as good as Chifu Longguan at this age. Of course, Su Fengyan was even more so back then. Chifu Longguan was a bit nervous. He said in a trembling voice, "King of Bailiang, this lowly one has been an orphan since young. I'll go wherever there's food to eat. If your highness doesn't trust this lowly one, you can let this lowly one join the Bailiang frontier army. Even a foot soldier is fine. I won't hesitate to kill Baimang." At this time, Princess Hongyan laughed sinisterly and fanned the flames. "Orphan? Maybe your parents died under the hooves of the Bailiang cavalry? It's never too late for a gentleman to take revenge." Chifu Longguan was not as shrewd as her, but he was no fool. He couldn't hold back and cursed. "Bitch! Bullshit your mother," the young man said with red eyes. "My parents were beaten to death by you rich and powerful bastards from the Southern Dynasty." Princess Hongyan was furious. The Southern Dynasty? What is the Southern Dynasty? The entire Southern Dynasty is just a watchdog raised by the Yelu family. I am Yelu Hongkai, a lowly person like you who can't even walk within 100 steps of me. Chifu Longguan's breathing was rapid, his chest heaving up and down. He took a big step forward and slapped this woman. Princess Hongyan was not a blockhead. She lowered her head and retreated, hiding behind Su Fengyan like a wisp of smoke. She chattered with a smug expression. "Hey, you can't hit me. Look at you, you deserve to never be able to avenge your parents. Oh, maybe trash like you was in the army and worked for the Southern Dynasty. Maybe you worked for those enemies." Chifu Longguan suddenly calmed down and stared at this woman. Princess Hongyan felt a bone-deep chill. She carefully took back the wine bowl and poured herself another bowl of green ant wine. At this time, there was a light knock on the door. Su Fengyan poured 2 bowls of wine and said softly, "Senior Tantai, please come in."